Good morning. Good morning and welcome to today's summit on international religious freedom. I'm Daniel Mark, chairman of USCIRF, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. It's an honor to be here with my colleagues, our guest speakers, and all of you. There's a curious part of the Exodus story where Moses asks Pharaoh for 3 days in the wilderness to worship God. It's curious because we know, as the reader, that the plan is no 3-day prayer retreat, but a full-on emancipation. Is Moses trying to trick Pharaoh? And even if the ruse works, what good would it be? He, like Pharaoh, knows that the sea stands in the way of their escape. For that reason, one wonders why Pharaoh refuses. He can always send the army after them, just as he does when they finally do leave. The answer, perhaps, is that both Moses and Pharaoh understand that the opportunity to go worship God, even briefly, and even if the Israelites return to slavery, would establish the principle that the people under Pharaoh's rule do not ultimately belong to Pharaoh, but to God. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. The coins belong to Caesar because they bear his image, but human beings, from the lowliest servant to Caesar himself, belong to God because they bear his image. In this way, religious freedom stands as the ultimate bulwark against totalitarianism. No matter how much control the government has, no matter the regime, religious freedom testifies that there is a source of authority beyond the state, an authority that limits the state's totalizing impulses. But what is religious freedom? All of our rights are sacrosanct because they protect basic human goods, that is, our ability to pursue the ingredients in a flourishing human life. The term freedom of conscience gets thrown around a lot, but it needs to be better understood. I like to tell my students often, something I learned from my teacher, that a good life starts and ends with 3 steps: asking the most important questions, seeking the best answers, and then living accordingly. For most people, 84% of the world's population, according to one study, that means living out our highest, most sacred obligations in the form of a religious life devoted to the divine, to God. This right is enshrined in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and because it entails the right to practice, quote, either alone or in community with others and in public or in private, unquote, it also necessarily entails other rights such as freedom of expression and freedom of association. Because religious freedom opens in this way the door to the whole panoply of human rights, both conceptually and practically, authoritarian regimes desperately resist it. It is critical to note that this means denying religious freedom not only to religious minorities, but indeed to the majority as well. People who are not free to dissent are not free, even if they happen to conform to the state-sponsored sect. This is one of many reasons why blasphemy and apostasy laws are so pernicious. They oppress every single person who lives under them because they establish the principle that the state decides what you believe. Problems such as these are particularly concerning as we see more and more evidence emerge showing strong correlations between religious freedom and a host of critical social indicators such as prosperity, stability, and peace. And so it is more important than ever that religious freedom be elevated as a priority in U.S. foreign policy. There are many competing priorities, to be sure, but there are positive signs about the direction of U.S. policy and beyond. IRFA, the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, the 20th anniversary of which we mark at this event, which created both our commission, USCIRF, and the IRF office at the State Department, expressed the desire of Congress that religious freedom not be overlooked. The 2016 Frank Wolf Act as well increased funding for international religious freedom and increased funding for international religious freedom. Both signal Congress's enduring, emphatic commitment to this issue. After seeing the role of ambassador at large for international religious freedom filled so capably in the last administration, this administration put into office another passionate, dedicated advocate for the cause. The administration also highlighted the importance of international religious freedom in the most recent national security strategy. And this is just within the U.S. Outside the U.S., we see the growth of the International Panel of Parliamentarians for Freedom of Religion or Belief, which USCIRF nurtured. There has also been a proliferation of national and international offices around the world dedicated to this issue, and we are delighted at the opportunity to collaborate with them. Together, we can all help to develop and implement the existing policies and new tools that are necessary in this world, which sees so many rising challenges to religious freedom. Today's panels will explore the state of international religious freedom and some of the tools for change, and shine a spotlight on several prisoners of conscience on whose behalf I urge all of us to speak. Our summit ends with a call to action that I hope will direct and energize us as we work in support of this fundamental, foundational freedom, what we rightly call here in this country, the first freedom. Let me turn now immediately to the beginning of our first panel in the interest of our tight schedule. During this plenary, panelists will be discussing the state of the union, so to speak, of international religious freedom, and ask each other tough questions, perhaps, about the status and future of international religious freedom. I welcome today an extraordinarily distinguished panel of Robert George, Katrina Lantos Swett, Leonard Leo, and David Saperstein. While they are here as former USCIRF chairs, they also have distinguished careers which are included in their bios, which you can find on the table. I will ask them to speak each. This is a criminal request to ask them each to speak only for 5 minutes, as distinguished and accomplished as each of them is. But again, in the interest of our program, we will have them each speak for 5 minutes and then ask each other questions as they wish, perhaps based on those presentations. We're going to begin with Dr. Katrina Lantos Swett, please. And if you'd like, you're all, because it's so short, if you just want to stay at the table, please feel free.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to maybe ask you all first to join me in giving a round of applause to the chair, Daniel Mark, for his fantastic opening statement. He so quickly went into introducing us that I think people didn't have a chance to acknowledge just how wonderful his opening remarks were. It is such a pleasure for me to be here today. In some senses, it feels like an old home day because these gentlemen that I'm seated at the table with, I consider each of them to be more than friends. They are friends, but they're people for whom I have such admiration that I always feel a little humble and perhaps not quite up to the task when I'm in their presence. And the same holds true for so many people in the audience as I look around. There is always a very special atmosphere when you're gathered together with people whose primary passion really is the defense of this fundamental freedom. And so that's sort of where I want to begin, with some passion. Like my colleagues, and I think everybody here in this room, I am passionate about the subject of freedom of religion, conscience, and belief. During the 4 years that I had the great privilege of serving on USCIRF, I came to appreciate even more deeply than I had before how essential this bedrock human right is, not only to our individual sense of dignity and integrity, but to our civic diversity and flourishing, and to our national security and safety. I am thrilled, and I want to commend USCIRF for convening this event, this summit, to recognize the importance of the passage of IRFA, the International Religious Freedom Act, 20 years ago. And I see in the audience the author of that act, former Congressman Frank Wolf, and really we have to acknowledge him with a round of applause too, because he is a hero of the religious freedom movement. And in some senses, we are all living in the house that Congressman Wolf built. So thank you, Congressman Wolf. It was and remains a truly noble piece of legislation that seeks to give muscle and sinew and some measure of accountability to our shared conviction about the centrality of this foundational and universal human right. There can be no doubt that religious freedom continues to be imperiled in much of the world. And off the top of my head, I could cite so many venues and places, from the Christian and Catholic community in Vietnam, the Uyghur community in Xinjiang province of China, the Ahmadi Muslims in Pakistan. And we will, I'm sure, be getting to some of those particular areas of concern. And of course, much of our conversation today will be about what we can do, how we can more effectively advocate on behalf of this fundamental right, and on behalf specifically of those being persecuted for their convictions. But in my opening remarks, I would like, with your indulgence, to share two stories that I think illustrate, maybe from that 20,000 altitude level, why this is so important. The first story is kind of the big picture from history. A few years ago, I traveled to Berlin to participate in the OSCE's 10-year anniversary conference examining the problem of anti-Semitism in the EU, which, as I'm sure many of you know, has seen an alarming rise in recent years. It was a sobering and in many ways a discouraging conference, but an experience I had while there also reinforced my conviction that history is not kind to, nor does it ultimately reward those who trample on the religious rights and freedoms of others. This truth was vividly underscored while I was on a brief tour of Berlin during a break from the conference. I was struck by the comment of the tour guide that when the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1685, thousands of persecuted Huguenots fled from France to the city of Berlin, where they started many of the industries and trades that became the backbone of that region's economy. Now, at this juncture, I always like to say, you will recall about the Edict of Nantes, but understanding that perhaps not everybody recalls the Edict of Nantes with great particularity, let me just say that this edict was signed in 1598 by Henry IV of France, and it had granted to the Calvinist Huguenots substantial rights in a nation that was overwhelmingly Catholic. This was a break from the long-standing tradition that the religion of the ruler of a nation would determine the religion of those he ruled. It was well summed up in the Latin phrase, cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, his religion. One might view the Edict of Nantes as an early advancement of the right to freedom of religion, and of course its revocation was a huge step backwards. But the key point that I want to make is that by driving the Huguenots out of their land, it was the French who suffered, economically and in other ways, and the community that gave them refuge benefited. Now, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see some analogies to the controversies of today regarding refugees and immigrants, but that's a conversation for another day. The key point that I would like to emphasize, as illustrated by the case of the Huguenots fleeing to Berlin, is that protecting religious liberty in the long run is not just the right thing to do, it is almost always the smart thing to do as well. The second story is a very personal one and is from the life of my father, Tom Lantos. As some of you may know, he was the only survivor of the Holocaust ever elected to Congress, and he rose to become not only chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, but more importantly to me, he was the founder of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus and one of our nation's most forceful and eloquent advocates for human rights. He was a young Jewish teenager in 1944 when the Germans occupied his native Hungary, an ally that Berlin feared was on the verge of switching allegiances. The German occupation began the true nightmare for the Jews of Hungary. Ultimately, some 500,000 Hungarian Jews lost their lives during the horror of that time. My dad, like thousands of other Jewish boys, was rounded up and sent to a slave labor camp outside of the capital, Budapest, where he was conscripted into forced labor under brutal conditions. He rarely spoke of this time, but many years later, his closest companion, who survived the slave battalion as well, shared this story from those dark days. The Hungarian commander of my father's labor group decided to burnish his reputation by compelling all the Jewish boys in his barracks to be baptized. They were frightened. They were essentially helpless and at his mercy. So they all complied, all except for two, my father and his friend Nori Kerenyi. They were badly beaten for their refusal, and yet they did not comply. From what I know of my father back then, he was not an especially religious teenager, although in the few letters that survived from that time, he wrote about his belief in God, a belief that over time would give way to a more skeptical agnosticism. But I don't think it was so much his deep religiosity that made him refuse to be baptized against his will. Of course, in part, it had to do with fidelity and and a kind of courageous devotion to his heritage and to his ancestors. But I think it was also his recognition that his inherent and his inalienable right to possess his own soul was at stake. And he was prepared to pay a very high price to defend it. Something within that young boy intuitively understood that if he were to allow this trampling upon his conscience, he would lose something of inestimable value. I like to think that the character my father developed, that made him such a brave and a bold defender of the rights of others, began in that moment when he chose his integrity and his dignity over his safety. And I know there are many people here with us today who have made similar choices in their own fulcrums of testing and trial. So the work of defending freedom of conscience is really, I believe, among the most important that we can be engaged in. And I want to commend all those up here and those out there who are engaged in it. And I very much look forward to the balance of our discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for your introductory remarks, and thanks very much to the Commission for holding this important and very timely dialogue to celebrate the passage of 20 years of legislation. Quite all right. Thank you again for your introduction, and thank you also to the Commission for holding this extremely important and timely dialogue, celebrating the passage 20 years ago of legislation that's been so important in bolstering the U.S.'s role in delivering and defending religious freedom around the world. In my remarks, which are going to be a little more detailed in terms of various hotspots around the world, I'd like to reflect on lingering threats of impunity, dangers for religious freedom in sub-Saharan Africa, and finally, my concerns about some developments in the West that may reduce our standing in promoting religious rights and freedoms in other parts of the world. And then I'd like to conclude with a call to action to avoid complacency and to advance USCIRF's mission to defend the universal right to freedom of religion or belief abroad. Impunity has been a growing focus of this commission, and it remains an area meriting very close scrutiny by the U.S. And its allies. In some countries, religiously motivated killers carry out their work in daylight and often suffer no consequences due to the authorities' lack of resources or of sheer will. Pakistan, for example, a country containing a vibrant ecosystem of militant Islamist groups, breeds some of the worst examples. To appease Islamist extremists who respond violently to criticism of strict Sharia principles, Pakistani authorities have targeted speech deemed insulting to Islam with blasphemy laws providing for prison and death sentences. As early as February, as many as 800 Christian families fled their homes to escape a riot in the country's second largest city, Lahore, after the state brought blasphemy charges against a Christian man over comments he made on Facebook. In Egypt, vulnerable Coptic Christians face extensive persecution by Islamist extremists who do not recognize their right to exist. In December, for example, a mob south of Cairo ended Friday mosque prayers by attacking a nearby Coptic church. The purported reason for the attack: the church was unregistered because the Egyptian administration had allowed its application to languish for 15 years. Other examples of impunity abound around the world. In Bangladesh, the recent knife attack against a popular science professor and secular writer, Muhammad Zafar Iqbal, revealed the worrying links of violent extremism with the country's military establishment. In Turkey, Western security experts have warned that the country's increasingly authoritarian Islamist government has given safe haven to extremist groups for jihadi activities in Eurasia, in exchange for assistance with Ankara's war against Kurds in Turkey and Syria. Some of the most acute instances of impunity and other threats to religious freedom take place in sub-Saharan Africa, and this continues to be a growing hotspot. Here, the principles of liberal democracy, constitutionalism, and the rule of law are stymied by a resurgent, radicalized, militant Islam mobilizing against perceived threats. The history of colonialism that shattered any semblance of indigenous rule or promotion of tolerance, and current rulers and power brokers using religion to gain power and resources. Nigeria is a country that the Commission visited frequently during my tenure, and a place where USCIRF was at the cutting edge in warning the world and policymakers of the danger of religious conflict and the threat of a Nigerian brand of militant Islam. Boko Haram, the Islamic terrorist group based out of northern Nigeria that has pledged allegiance to ISIS and whose name means Western education is forbidden, has murdered thousands. It has kidnapped hundreds to thousands of people, including young girls. It has wreaked havoc on northern Nigeria, and it has targeted Christians in its war to establish an Islamic state under Sharia law in Nigeria and beyond. Similarly, in Somalia and Kenya, Al-Qaeda-aligned al-Shabaab has killed hundreds to perhaps thousands of people in high-profile terrorist attacks as its campaigns to establish interpretation of Islamic Sharia law. In Eritrea, the government views religion as a threat to its existence. The Eritrean government has imprisoned an Orthodox Christian patriarch for over 10 years because he opposed the government's actions against the church. Thousands of Christians are imprisoned or face harsh treatment because they are viewed as abnormal and a threat to order. Baha'i and other religious places of worship have been closed with padlocks for years. In Sudan, the government is a mix of rulers using religion to gain power and wealth, and true believers who wish to impose a militant version of Islam upon the Sudanese people. Authorities treat Christians as second-class citizens and their bishops as threats to national security. In the Central African Republic, the scene is one of chaos and religiously motivated violence due to a primarily Muslim-led coup attempt in 2013 and a largely Christian-based militant response to it. These instances of impunity and violence are shocking in their severity and breadth. But while we focus on extinguishing the flames of sectarian conflict and oppression in countries like these, we cannot ignore less visible creeping religious freedom violations in our own backyard. The Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe, a religious freedom watchdog, provides some of the starkest examples of the almost unnoticed trend of threats to Christians in the West. Within the last 2 months alone, the observatory has documented numerous instances of arson and vandalism at churches in Western Europe, including the decapitation of sacred statues, desecration of Christian icons, dismantling of crosses atop graves, and even placement of a Molotov cocktail inside a church in Spain after a vandal had sprayed threatening graffiti on the facade of it. The recent migration crisis in Europe has spotlighted the need for government responses to religiously motivated attacks, particularly among arriving migrants, many of whom are Christian refugees who have fled persecution in their homelands. To maintain our standing in the world as a beacon against oppression, we also must put our own house in order by addressing subtler forms of coercion. Freedom of speech, especially from groups with a particular religious perspective, is under threat on university campuses throughout Western Europe and some places here. The right of parents to give their children a religious upbringing faces threats from government officials, notably in cases in Germany and Sweden, where there are cases of authorities in recent years using homeschooling as a justification to remove children from their parents. Looking ahead, even broader intrusions may be coming. We must understand the religious freedom implications of laws, regulations, and codes of conduct rapidly expanding across the West that seek to curtail a broad category of speech, often online, deemed to be incitement to hatred. How can we lecture states on repealing their blasphemy laws when we give authorities broad tools to prevent religious speech that fails to conform to the official view of what it means to be a, quote, good citizen? The previous examples of impunity and religious freedom violations highlight countries in South Asia, the Mideast, and Sub-Saharan Africa, where the lack of recognition of the rule of law, liberal democracy, and constitutionalism has led to violent persecution of religious minorities. Such freedom will not go unchallenged either at home or abroad, meaning that every generation must work tirelessly to uphold the sacred governing principles relating to the free exercise of religion everywhere in the world. And it is such a blessing that in our country we have USCIRF here defending these principles of religious freedom abroad. And thank you for the Commission's ongoing attention to these issues.
Our third speaker is the Honorable Rabbi David Saperstein.
Let me pick up where Leonard Leo in his superb presentation left off. Just want to say a word of my appreciation to USCIRF here, and it really is an extraordinary entity, and I hope we have a little bit of time to talk more about what it has done and what it has achieved. Looking from the perspective of somebody who worked at the State Department, where every single day we have a cascade of things that you just described coming in that we have to respond to. The ability of an entity dedicated to be not just a watchdog to how well the government is doing and where it can make recommendations, where it can do better, but to actually get into, substantively, in depth, some of these core issues, and in depth into particular countries, has added immensely to the intellectual capital and the political efficacy of efforts going on. So on this 20th anniversary, I simply want to express my appreciation. I think just as we look across this table, there are two of us were appointed by Democrats, two of us were appointed by Republicans, and that has been one of the strengths. I think that USCIRF at its best has been when bipartisan cooperation has unified them in recommendations. I remember back to my own day here, the initial report with 52 recommendations, despite some cynicism at the beginning of the process, 50 of them ended up being unanimous. And the fact that they were really allowed it to have an enormous impact in shaping what came after here. And as one of those commissioners in that initial commission, who went on to some achievement, certainly only because of what he learned serving on the commission, John Bolton. He and I were having breakfast on South by Southwest when news came about Secretary Tillerson's dismissal, and we spoke together in a panel on this subject here. So it's interesting, he pointed out that American foreign policy is very complex, but having the international religious freedom component as a key element strengthens American foreign policy, both in pursuing our vital interests and also in showing the world what our values are. I think that for Americans, freedom of religion is a foundational aspect of freedom of conscience, that you have freedom of speech, for press, association, but all that began in the context of the search for religious liberty. I hope that animates the work that he will be doing, and I hope it'll give the opportunity for us to engage with him in furthering this as the administration is develop its own policy in this area. We know what the key threats to to religious freedom are. We've heard a number of them. I'm sure Rabbi will also expand on that. But the non-state actors that have arisen in the last decade on the world scene, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and other extremist groups in other religions, whether we're talking about Christian militias in the Central African Republic or extremists in the Hindu community in the Indian subcontinent, or in the militant Buddhist groups that are generating much of the antipathy toward the Rohingya. All of this is a serious threat that results in the kind of violent attacks on religion, and even when not in organized form, on the societal level, that animates much of the violent attacks on those with whom they disagree within their own religion, or in terms of those of other religions whose very views sometimes, whose expression of their sincerely held views is often considered blasphemous. Which brings me to the second category of blasphemy laws. It is a central challenge to us. As I was meeting with foreign ministers and justice ministers and ministers of religious affairs, they would point out, well, what about all the European countries that have blasphemy laws? Some just on the books, but they don't distinguish between that. Or my favorite, what about the 6 states in the United States that have blasphemy laws on the books? Here, you all know what they are? Those deep red states like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. Robbie, you got some work to do up there. They're in Michigan and Wyoming and Oklahoma and South Carolina. Here we have some work to do here as well, not because it can be implemented here. The Supreme Court already dealt with that in the 1950s, but simply because the existence of those laws is a serious has a serious impact in undercutting our effort to get other countries to actually change laws that can not only result in enforcement, but at least in 12 countries in the death penalty. In the fight against terrorism and the need for security that often gives a rationale to governments to be able to crack down on religions that they are frightened about. Of course, we know, and it brings me to the fourth category of the normal repressive instincts of authoritarian regimes to try through registration regimes, through the monitoring of every aspect of religious identity in a number of countries, just requiring religion over and above other similarly situated groups to get permission for the simplest things to function, to hold, well, this year we're going to hold an Easter service this year, as though we didn't last year, and the year before that, and the year before that, and needing permission year after year after year. So those kinds of efforts, often done either in the name of fighting extremism or for security, or simply to keep control, authoritarian regimes are frightened by the way that any people organize their life around principles that they can't control. And so they try to control it. Here, let me just add one other dynamic. Many of you saw the Pew report from about 6 months ago that kind of analyzed the number of countries that had official state religions, 22%. The numbers that have preferred religions, of the 22%, 2/3 are Muslim. The 20% that have preferred religions, and of those preferred religions, 70% is Christianity. And that in those states that have those, there is a higher level, a demonstrably higher level of repression of religious freedom. So compared to those who don't, if we exclude those handful of countries, the 5% of countries that are just hostile to religion altogether, a number of which you name, China and others in that category. So, that's also a way to engage on that is crucially important to us. America, one of America's greatest contribution to world thought, flows from the 3 prongs of the Constitution on religion: no religious tests for office, free exercise of religion, no establishment of religion. Taken together, they promised that for the first time in human history, that the rights that you had as a citizen would never depend upon your religious identity, practices, or beliefs. Now, we know it took 150 years to get there. It was not until the 1940s that the Supreme Court began to robustly interpret the Free Exercise and Establishment Clause. But from that point on, that dream really has become real. I mean, if you look at the polling data, you know, with all of the problems we have of discrimination against some religious groups in America, but if you look at the flow, minority religious groups do quite well in terms of how they're viewed and looked at by Americans compared to what it was in the 1940s. Particularly true with Catholics and Jews, and the enormous change in the perception of Catholics and Jews in the United States by the Protestant community. That was the time that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ICCPR were being drafted. It had an enormous impact on them. And that idea that your rights as a citizen would not depend on your religious identity, practices, or beliefs was enshrined in those documents. It is the battle that we need. If we win that battle more than anything else, we will really work effectively to change the entire world scene on the question of the repression of religious life. Just think about it. If simply everyone had equal citizen rights without regard to religion, what a different world it would be in these respects. Finally, I just want to list a few things that maybe we'll have time to talk about, but the number of challenges that I think that we have to deal with, the paradoxes in what we espouse. I already named one. We urge countries to quell extremists, whether done in the name of religion or not, but it includes religious extremists, and in the effort of doing that, trying to determine who can be a religious leader, what they can say in the pulpits, what kind of money can flow in to support their efforts, we paradoxically have enormous restrictions on religious freedom. Another paradox is we talk about and pay lip service to and give examples from the long run impact that countries that give more freedoms in general, more religious freedoms, will be more stable. But for countries who have restrictions on religious freedom and other fundamental rights lifted, that don't have a tradition of pluralism, that don't have a tradition of democracy, the short-term impact has often been to allow religious extremists to organize and expand and often grab political power that they wouldn't have had. Paradox. How can we deal better with that? How do we deal better, many of you have heard me talk about this before, with the question of how we support moderate religious groups? Moderate is a comment having nothing to do with theology. I define moderate for the purposes of this comment simply any group that eschews the use of force, either in the form of violent force emanating from them or the coercive force of government, to control the religious lives of others. How do we support moderates without our Christian, Jewish, atheist, Western embrace of those moderate groups being used by the extremists to delegitimize and undercut them in their own communities, in the battle for the hearts and minds of the people in the streets of countries across the globe? These are just a few of some of the really tough issues that I think we need to have better statecraft about, better diplomatic efforts about, better work from the interfaith community on behalf of this. And just 30 seconds to flag the issue. I really believe that one of the great overlooked issues at this time, among the many that have already been named, is the plight of the Rohingyas. I just returned from a trip back to Bangladesh to visit people in Cox's Bazar. The horrid conditions that existed in Myanmar, the refusal of Aung San Suu Kyi to allow humanitarian groups and fact-finding groups into the region, but the enormous strains that this huge influx is having on Bangladesh, who are proud of their having welcomed these numbers of people, but is creating a structure of destabilization that will give extremists the ability to recruit. We've seen the impact of sex trafficking, both in Rakhine and the northern areas, forced labor in the jade mines here of northern Myanmar, and sex trafficking escalating significantly in the camps in Bangladesh. Here, we're running out of time with the monsoon season coming. This is a crisis of the first order, and I really hope that the religious communities and the democratic countries of the world are going to work together to significantly address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Is it on? Yeah, okay, good, thank you. It's a pleasure to be back within the precincts of USCIRF and really back in the embrace of the USCIRF family. I've been away for 2 years. I feel like the prodigal son, but it's great to be back, and it's such an honor to be on this panel with Daniel Mark, of whom I'm very proud. Daniel was my student at Princeton, both as an undergraduate and a graduate student, and he's gone on to great distinction, not only as a teacher and as a scholar, but as a member and now chairman of USCIRF. I am so grateful for Daniel's service and the inspiring example he sets. And speaking of inspiring examples, what an honor to be on this panel with two brothers and a sister who have long been my comrades in arms in this wonderful but challenging cause of fighting for religious freedom. Ambassador David Saperstein, Leonard Leo, and Christina Lantos Swett are champions and heroes of the fight for religious liberty. They have worked selflessly in the cause and been very inspiring to me, as I know they have been to so many of you and so many others. And speaking of heroes, Frank Wolf. My goodness, Frank Wolf. Literally, where would we be without Frank Wolf? We would not be here gathered together. This nation would not. This nation would not have the deep commitment to advancing religious freedom abroad as well as at home, were it not for the work and witness of Frank Wolf. So today, as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of USCIRF, we're really celebrating the achievement of Frank Wolf. I have to share a little story. It's one of the most, not everything about politics is wonderful, but one of the wonderful moments that I witnessed personally in politics was when Congressman Wolf was retiring. And I was testifying that day. Katrina, I believe you were there as well. We were testifying before the Lantos Human Rights Commission, whose Democratic co-chairman was Representative James McGovern, another great champion, along with Frank Wolf, of religious freedom. And Congressman McGovern, Representative McGovern, right there, Representative McGovern, who is progressive from Massachusetts, very different from the ideological profile of Congressman Wolf, in saying goodbye, said the following. He said, you know, Frank Wolf and I are different. In Frank Wolf's district, and he were seeking re-election, I would vote for him. Noting there was not only Frank's religious freedom, which such an shared. Thank you. USCIRF has been standing for 20 years. Yeah, okay. How about now? USCIRF has been standing for 20 years, firmly solid for religious freedom, and not just for religious freedom as an abstraction, for the religious freedom of concrete flesh and blood human beings, individuals, and communities of every faith and those of no faith who are victims or potential of victims of persecution and abuse. When USCIRF was founded, and for several years after its founding, it was in some circles defamed, as was Frank Wolf and people allied with Frank Wolf in building USCIRF, by the claim that USCIRF was only interested in protecting the rights of Christians and even a narrow sect of Christians, evangelical Christians. That was a defamation, that was a false beginning, and USCIRF, over its 20-year life, has shown what a falsehood that is. USCIRF has genuinely stood for the rights of all. Now, in 1998, the so-called secular thesis was still dominant in our intellectual culture, and I think it's fair to say within the government and certainly within the diplomatic corps. And the secularism thesis, famously propounded by Peter Berger, the distinguished sociologist at the Boston University, was that as modernization progressed, religion would decline. Religion, and therefore the question of religious freedom, will decreasingly be an issue and decreasingly be a concern because we're all going to end up as secularists eventually. Well, of course, that didn't happen, and nobody today believes the secularism thesis. It's a rare intellectual thesis because it's actually been falsified. So we do have to take, whether we are religious ourselves or not, we do have to take religion seriously, and by we, I mean all of us. I mean anybody who's concerned about justice and human rights. Certainly the government has to take religious freedom seriously, and I think those who represent the government, those who hold public offices, whether they are presidents of the United States or United States senators or governors or state representatives or diplomats representing our country abroad, need to understand religion and religious people if they are to do their jobs which include centrally protecting the freedom of religion and belief of all. So that means that there's an educational mission that USCIRF helps to advance, as well as the mission of advancing substantive policies for the protection of religious freedom. Now, my fellow panelists have noted absolutely correctly that threats to religious freedom come from governments, certainly they do, from non-state actors, increasingly an issue, one of which we were not especially cognizant, had no reason to be cognizant of in 1998, but we sure are cognizant of today. Also, I would add, as a distinct, although related category, the category of civil society. There are places where religious freedom is neglected, violated, cast aside, because civil society is constituted in such a way as to render individuals, members of minority religious communities vulnerable to persecution and abuse. Myanmar, which David has discussed, is a very example of this. But there are many, Saudi Arabia, many others, where religion or certain religions cannot have their rightful place, people cannot have their rights respected because civil society simply finds them intolerable. This provides fertile grounds for the impunity that Leonard placed so much focus on, absolutely rightly placed so much focus on. And I think it's an issue that really has to be taken up and needs to be addressed not only by government leaders in these countries, but also by religious leaders. Government can only do so much in this or any other area. Civil society itself has to reform civil society or play a key role in reforming civil society where civil society is in need of reform, for example, in order to become more protective and respectful of religious rights. And here I think religious leaders of all faiths bear a great responsibility and have an enormous opportunity. I see steps being taken in various places in the right direction by leaders of various faiths. I commend strongly the Marrakesh Declaration on the rights of non-Muslims and majority Muslims. Muslim societies. I commend Sheikh Abdullah bin Baya, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and others who were involved, who were the engine of the Marrakesh Declaration. We need to see more of that kind of thing, especially where civil society is a problem. And we need to see it not only within the Muslim world, but in other religious communities as well. Now, often, civil society really is a problem in its own right. But sometimes, governments hide behind the problems in civil society to rationalize, attempt to justify, excuse their own delinquent behavior, either their failure to protect or their policies which are themselves outright violations of religious liberty. And here I want to put the finger on Saudi Arabia as one example. So if you ask the Saudis, Saudi officials, about violations of religious freedom in their country, violations, for example, of the rights of guest workers, Filipino and other Christian guest workers, they will point the finger at civil society and say, well, we would like to be more tolerant of people having Christian, Jewish Bibles. We'd like to be, maybe we would be in theory open to having churches on the peninsula, but you know, it just wouldn't work here because civil society won't permit it. It's not our fault. Don't blame us. We'd love to do the right thing. It's civil society. That's excuse making. It's exploiting a half-truth to do nothing. What really needs to be done in situations like those are reforms within civil society and reforms of government policies. Where both needed, they both have to be done. I also think that in addition to the leadership of religious leaders, we need greater and more visible interreligious cooperation. It will be a great help with the faithful of all faiths and with civil society where civil society is itself a problem. If everyone can see leaders of different traditions, Hindu leaders and Muslim leaders, where there are tensions between Hindus and Muslims, Christian leaders, Muslim leaders, wherever you have tension between groups, if we practice and exemplify cooperation toward common goals, and remember that whatever our differences are among the religions, we have many common values and many common goals. If we can make the pursuit of those a visible project of our leadership, I think the example we will set for civil society will pay enormous benefits, and not only in the long run. I think even in the short term, see the transformations that we need to see happening in civil society. The final point I want to make is this. Especially when we're looking at Western Europe and some other Western nations, we need to be cognizant of the fact that secularist ideologies can and do, in many cases, function as religions in many ways in the lives of their, if I can use quotation marks, faithful. And the rights of secularists need to be protected. Their rights to religious freedom and belief need to be protected as much as anybody else's. And at the same time, we need to be careful lest violations in the name of secularist ideology of the religious freedom of other people take place in a way that is rendered invisible by the secularist or allegedly non-religious nature of secularist ideologies. There should be a fair playing field on which the various worldviews, comprehensive views, to use the phrase of the late political philosopher John Rawls, religions can compete fairly and can interact. But if one view, be it secularist or religious, declares itself to be the umpire and not a contestant or a participant in the contest and interaction, it's very likely to be calling the balls and strikes in a way that's very favorable to its own viewpoints, its own doctrines, its own dogmas, its own beliefs, undermining, neglecting, violating the rights of others. So whether we're talking about secularism or secularist ideologies, be they communist or Western progressive, whatever they are, or whether we're talking about religions, it's very important that the plane on which the competition and interaction and cooperation takes place be a fair one across the board. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all of you. Those were extraordinary remarks. Unsurprisingly, I should say, if I forgot at the beginning, to say that the bios of each of our extremely distinguished speakers in the folder that's on your chair. In the interest of time, we skipped the introductions. The introductions of any one of these people alone would have taken the entire session. And so we are very grateful. This discussion has given us really a lot to think about and will help set the stage quite nicely for our next panel on strategies to make positive change. Because we are so short on time, we will begin a very short break now, and we ask you to return to your seats after thanking, we'll thank the panelists, and then we'll ask you to return to your seats in about 10 minutes to continue the program. Thank you.
Well, that worked. Let's, if I can ask you to take your seats, and we'll get started. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We may have to move these past the mics that are working well. This panel has been asked to discuss how we can better promote freedom of religion and belief, which I'd argue is the most basic of human rights, what I and other commissioners have been calling the foundational human right. And here's why. Without recognition of that right, one cannot reasonably expect the development of other rights, such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. Freedom of religion and belief must be the foundation on which we build. Discussions about international religious freedom often start and end with the International Religious Freedom Act, commonly known as USCIRF, which we've been discussing, which was passed to promote religious freedom as a foreign policy of the United States, as a priority of the United States, and to promote advocacy on behalf of individuals, like the ones you see here, persecuted in foreign countries because of their beliefs. As everyone here knows, the regimes that most egregiously violate religious freedom or belief are designated as countries of particular concern, or CPCs. We also now designate entities of particular concern, EPCs. This names and shames, and no question some regimes are more shamed by being named than others. USCIRF is soon to issue its 2018 annual report. It will make CPC, EPC, and watch list recommendations and highlight tools that the U.S. government can and should use to support freedom of religion and belief, and to hold violators of this right accountable. The question I've been leading up to, are there other tools available that we are not using or not using effectively? Is there what might be called an USCIRF Plus approach that USCIRF commissioners and staff should be considering? And what would an USCIRF Plus plan look like? How might such a plan be utilized by USCIRF and by our allies in the international religious community? These are questions we've asked our panelists today to discuss and debate. I'm pleased to welcome Farinaz Isfahani from the Wilson Center, Richard Goldberg from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Tom Gallagher from Religion News Service, and Sharon Pate from the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative. You can find their full biographies, and I urge you to read them on the information table. Farinaz will focus on women and their empowerment and how that can boost religious freedom. Rich on using carefully targeted economic sanctions to promote religious freedom. Tom on using the media as a tool for religious freedom. And Sharon on the next steps for the religious freedom movement. I want to say I'd also like the panelists to question one another. This is going to be a conversation, not a series of remarks. I'd like them to play devil's advocate, to mix it up a little bit, and I'd like you to participate as well. While the conversation's going on, I'll look around the room. If you give me a hand, I'll know to come to you after we kind of get some of the basics on the questions. I'll take moderator's prerogative and start the conversation going. I'm going to start with you, Rich. The U.S. has used economic sanctions to address issues such as terrorism, proliferation, but religious freedom, sanctions would you say our sanctions are underutilized in this area, could be utilized more? USCIRF has recommended sanctions often. They've been adopted infrequently. Once, I think, is the answer. Talk a little bit about what sanctions could do if USCIRF has the determination, and if Congress and the executive branch agree that as a tool of foreign policy, sanctions should be implemented.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. No question that we have historical precedent to show that economic sanctions can change behavior. Not all of them are created equal, but if they are applied to a strategic weakness of a state, if they are applied in a very careful way to an individual or agency that really ratchets up pressure and makes life difficult, you can get behavioral change. We've seen that in the case of Iran, as Congress really ratcheted up pressure and targeted strategic weaknesses of the regime, especially between 2010 and 2013. Whether you're for or against the nuclear deal, it's immaterial. Everybody agrees that brought the regime to the table under pressure. We've seen that just today, what's going on with North Korea. A maximum pressure campaign actually applied, clearly, could be doing something different. The regime is feeling some pressure. But the question always becomes, how can you get our political leaders who are balancing a wide range of strategic interests to take action against the states? Which state will they or will they not be willing to use such economic levers with? We've seen that over the past. In some cases, it's easier in some ways to unload economic sanctions on a country like Iran or on North Korea or on Syria. Whereas in a case of Pakistan or Egypt, our leaders, because they're balancing multiple strategic issues, are hesitant to do so. And so we have on the books, even inside the statute for the International Religious Freedom Act, if a country is labeled a CPC, there is supposed to be a menu of economic sanctions that are applied. That just doesn't happen for various reasons that we just talked about. But even those sanctions really aren't even enough. And we have other sanctions on the books that can be applied, various cases. We have the Global Magnitsky Act, which is a global sort of human rights application. You have various authorities that Congress has passed country by country in Iran or Syria for human rights violations. But again, if you look at how those are applied and how they've been conceived, they don't go far enough to really exert pressure on an individual. A person may not be able to keep their assets in the U.S. They may not be eligible for government contracts as if they cared. But what about their travel? What about their family's travel? What about their assets they hold outside the United States? Why is a European bank allowed to hold their assets? These are the sort of secondary sanctions, as they're called, steps, that we need to think about to really exert pressure on individuals. And in the case of a state, if we do have a balancing act that we're trying to keep, we need people to, on an interagency level, really develop ideas of strategic weaknesses that we can exploit, even in those countries where we have other strategic interests.
Let me follow up with one question before we go on to other panelists. I can understand why a recommendation for sanctions for Saudi Arabia on religious freedom grounds, the U.S. government would say, we don't want to do that. We have other equities. We have other interests. We've got negotiations going on various things. We're not going to put that pressure on. I understand less well when you're talking about, for example, Iran, Why? Because you have, under the Iran deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, you cannot impose right now sanctions on the nuclear portfolio. But it was always said that this does not give immunity from all other forms of sanctions. So since you know the Baha'i are being oppressed in Iran, since you know Christians are suffering in Iran, since you know various other groups, Sunnis are, why not, would not be useful to say, let's impose sanctions in Iran? And just one other point I'd make, you and I know, that because research has been done by the organization with which we're affiliated, that the Iranians, although we don't have diplomatic relations, members of the elite love to send their kids to MIT and other schools here. We could make that impossible, and that would, it would seem to me, at least be some kind of discouragement from this kind of religious freedom violation that we see in Iran today.
Well, I completely agree with everything you said. I would break my response up into two pieces. One on the sort of Saudi Arabia case study, the other one on the Iranian question. I'll do the second first. On the Iranian question, you're absolutely right. There's nothing in the JCPOA that is supposed to preclude us from imposing sanctions for non-nuclear reasons. Even those sanctions that were waived under the JCPOA, a bank, a company, a person can have sanctions reimposed on them if they're engaged in non-nuclear illicit activities. I think your problem here is probably in Europe. We have, even though everybody celebrated a news report that the Europeans have re-upped their human rights sanctions for another year, congratulations. No new designation since the JCPOA. I mean, it's outrageous. And so clearly we know that Europe values its trading relationship with Iran, and there's going to have to be some sort of discussion with the Europeans to get serious on human rights abuses inside the regime, and there is no reason for them to hesitate to ratchet up pressure, as you're saying, and get more creative about it. I will say one thing on a case like Saudi Arabia, on Egypt, on Pakistan, and on others. Sometimes it's hard for an executive branch official to do certain things because of the diplomatic sensitivities. And it's easier when Congress starts putting pressure. And there's a good cop, bad cop routine that can happen. Even if sanctions are not fully imposed, even if they're only proposed by the Congress and there's a committee markup on it, these sort of things get the attention of governments very quickly. And you can produce certain behavioral change or at least a diplomatic process on the executive level to start forcing certain behavioral changes by a regime just by the threat of economic sanctions. Even if we would, if you're a State Department official and you're working with the Saudis in the Department of Energy on a 1, 2, 3 negotiation for their nuclear, civil nuclear program that they want, and you say, oh my God, this is not the right time. We can't propose economic sanctions in Saudi Arabia. It's crazy, and they're oil exporters. This is nuts. We need their help on Iran. Well, I mean, if you're in the Congress and you care about these issues, and you say, well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There's nothing that stops a congressman from introducing a bill, and that's going to get a government's attention very quickly.
I'm going to ask you one more thing because I just want to get this on the table as well. There are those who are opposed sanctions because they have the view that sanctions indiscriminately punish innocent people within the country. I think you will argue that's not necessarily true. If you target the sanctions, you can be very clear. It doesn't have to be a shotgun; it can be a sniper.
I think that's right. I think in general, that sort of argument has been made since the Cold War era. Had Scoop Jackson listened to that line of attack, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment would have never happened, and the course of history arguably would be very different. The bottom line is that people who are suffering from a wide range of human rights abuses, including religious freedom abuses, are living in fear. They're living under persecution. Their lives are hell. And until we get serious about holding their governments accountable, and really applying severe pressure where at some point they have to choose between regime survival and change of behavior, these people just continue to live in suffering. And so, to say that those who are trying to exert pressure to make life better for people are somehow the criminals is just a complete outrage.
All right, I'll move on, but if you have questions on that, again, let me know. We'll come back after we go through the panel. Farah, let me turn to you next. Conventional thinking, I won't say conventional wisdom, often holds that religion is an obstacle to the rights of women, to women's liberation, that religions are oppressive of women. And there is opposition to the work USCIRF does in certain quarters because you say, oh, if you promote religion, women's rights must suffer. Talk about that a little bit. And let's get real close to the mic and make sure it works. If you can't hear, let me know, please.
Can you hear me?
That's for the transcription.
Yeah, I think we'll have to try.
Oh,
thank you for telling us. Yeah, okay.
okay.
So, Cliff, that is a hugely important question. And I think that's one of the reasons that women have been almost ignored when you talk about religious freedom. You talk about communities, you talk about, diasporas, but you don't talk about women and families and children. You really don't, and there's no money for it, and there's no media coverage of it, and it's not a big deal. Why is this? And this is because between the left and right in this country, and it's very unfortunate because USCIRF has managed to bring together the left and right and the middle, the moderates in this country on most issues, but not this issue. Why? Because when you talk to feminists, and when I talk to women that I work with on, for example, violence against women issues, violence against women in politics issues, when I speak to them about religion, women being persecuted for their faith, they put their hands up and they say religion is the problem. And so they have left a huge number of women out of the conversation, as if they're non-people, as if that discrimination doesn't count somehow. So I've been trying to figure out where you come from a completely faith-based approach to a completely human rights approach, and those two have to be melded. And that's where I think, Cliff, what you talked about, IRFA plus plan, in that one of the major things that has to be talked about, that funding has to be brought together for, that the groups who work on women's rights and human rights have to work with those who work on religious freedom rights to be able to bring the issue of women of faith who are being persecuted from my home country of Pakistan to neighboring India now, to places in Europe, to places all over Africa, all over the world now. And why women? Cliff, why women for me? Because women are the most vulnerable in any society and community. And this is what we need to tell people who say no to religion. We're not asking everyone to be a person of faith, because we believe people have the right to have no faith also. But you cannot allow women of faith to be enslaved, to be raped, to be forcibly converted, and all of the things that we have discussed. Rabbi Saperstein talked about what was happening in Cox's Bazar. What those women and children are going through, the psychological trauma, which is something that no one's equipped to deal with, because everyone's just trying to put roof over their heads or food on their tables. Unless and until women become a major part of, number one, the funding, and my co-panelist here from Wilberforce, Sharon gave me this very strong point. She says, whereas human trafficking now is well funded both in the US, in Europe, and from all kinds of organizations, because people came together on this issue, that the issue of women and the issue of women of faith and the issue of the discrimination of women, there may be a Baha'i woman who is maybe not a religious Baha'i woman, but she will be discriminated against because she is Baha'i or Ahmadi or Christian. So the religious group matters, whether you yourself are a person of faith or not. So we need to be speaking a lot more of this language in the media, in op-eds, to groups, bringing together groups on every side of this. bringing it up in Congress, bringing it up in state with Ambassador Brownback, and also having people like Congressman Wolf, Rabbi Saperstein, and so many other people in this room who deeply care about religious freedom. So I say to all of you here that, I'm not talking about a marginal issue here. I'm not. This is as mainstream as it gets. And it's time for us, if in the United States of America we do not realize we're not talking about 50% of the people who are being discriminated against in vile physical and psychological ways, then are we really in 2018 or not? So I think, Cliff, I thank you very much. I thank you, sir, for inviting me here today, and I really hope we can make this part of your PLUS program, Cliff. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. Let me follow up with one question. I'll play devil's advocate, if that's a curious phrase to use in this context, I suppose. There are those who would say, yes, but religions discriminate against women. There are various religious and/or cultural practices that violate women's rights. You can't be a priest in a Catholic church if you're a woman. You can't preach from a pulpit in a mosque. I think in any of the various traditions of Islam. How do you respond to that, to the question of when religion is seen as, and maybe rightly so, violative of basic human rights or discriminates?
I think one of the things that we must make the difference, we're not defending religion. We're defending those people of faith or no faith at all who follow those religions. So if I want to sit here with my head covered today as a Muslim woman, I could, and I choose not to. And I can, because this is the United States of America, and we have religious freedom. Now, in some countries, those laws don't allow it. In some countries, the imams, and it's all about religious power, and we're not getting into that. So we're talking about religious freedom and not what each and every religion, they all have good and bad points, right? They all have things that as people, as faith, we ourselves struggle with. Personally, we struggle with those things, right? But let's not conflate the two. We're talking about religious freedom, and we have to defeat that kind of thinking to be able to protect women.
Tom, I'm going to go to you. Back in the last century when I was young, religion was covered fairly widely. I mean, the Newsweek and Time had religion writers. I was, for a time, an editor in Denver, Colorado. There were two newspapers. Both papers had religion writers. Today, there's barely one newspaper left in Denver, and Newsweek and Time, I doubt still have religion writers, and if they are, they're not as read. So I guess what I'm asking you to address is the fact that it's harder to get the attention of the public, the education of the public through the media about religious matters. You still do it, your organization still does it, but one has to search harder for that. We are not becoming, as a society, we are probably losing our education on religious matters and what's taking place. Talk about the media and religion.
Well, being in the media, it's a really easy job. It's not. We, at Religion News Service, we've been around for 84 years, covering religion. We're not affiliated with any religious tradition, and so we view ourselves as the Associated Press, if you will, of the religion beat. I think as a nonprofit news organization, we have a leg up on the commercial services simply because our model is different. It is a big challenge. Over the last, say, 10 years, many religion writers have been let go from budget cuts. We think that religion writers get cut first in newsrooms. And so we view our work at RNS as incredibly important. And so I have a few ideas I'd like to share about how all of you can encourage more religion writing and reporting. And these are very practical and very simple. One is encourage news organizations to actually cover religion. That's pretty simple, but the editors need to know that the readership wants stories around religion. Two, encourage news organizations to actually hire religion reporters. The New York Times made news a couple of weeks ago by hiring their second full-time reporter, in addition to Lori Goodstein, in hiring Elizabeth Diaz from Time. And so she's a terrific reporter. And so that was kind of big news in the religion beat. I would encourage all of you to get to know your religion reporters, both locally and nationally and internationally. That sounds kind of obvious, but if they don't know you, they're not going to always be responsive to your emails and phone calls. Religion reporters love to break news, and they love exclusives. And so as organizations and individuals, to the extent you can provide religion reporters exclusive and breaking news, that's helpful. Also, religion reporters need to be held accountable. And so we're held accountable every day. I got an email from a reader yesterday questioning our use of the Emancipation Proclamation, and it took us 10 minutes to answer his question, but we want that kind of feedback. We want to be held accountable. There's a news organization called the Religion News Association, which is the membership organization of all religion reporters in the U.S., rna.org. And they hold an annual conference in September. This year it's in Ohio. But you're all welcome to attend it and actually get to know, a couple hundred religion reporters in a couple days' time. So that happens every September. And then lastly, I kind of mentioned early on, support news organizations, commercially and nonprofit news organizations, because it takes money to produce this content. It takes real talent and bodies, and I'll have some more ideas to share with you about the importance of religion journalism. But I believe professional journalism covering religion can change the world. And it changes the world because it educates our readers. And the more readers can be educated, we hope it creates a mutual understanding and respect, and those kinds of realities can lead to peace and pluralism and thriving communities here and around the globe.
I'm just curious, when you're in a room like this with these folks here, do most of them know you, and do you know most of them, or a lot of them haven't actually reached out to you and made a relationship so that you're aware of what they're doing and they're aware of what you're writing?
So I've written about USCIRF in a positive manner. I believe...
But there's more than USCIRF in this room. There's various representatives of I don't know how many groups in the religious community or religious freedom community.
I've gotten to know a handful. I don't know everybody. But I welcome the opportunity to get connected. Religion News Service is largely focused in the U.S., but we cover the global beat. Often we'll cover it with stringers, or we'll cover it through the use of the AP wire. But stories in the U.S. often have an international component, right? So church organizations have missions. Obviously, religious groups are present here and around the globe. And so local experts can be very helpful to us as reporters and journalism organization. Now, having said that, I met one person not too long ago, and I get a press release every morning from this person. And I just simply can't read them. But he feels like he's doing me a service or himself a service. But you got to be selective in terms of how you engage the media because we're inundated with content.
And one more question I'm curious about. Are there still many religion reporters in Europe and in Asia and other parts of the world? I would imagine for budgetary reasons you can't simply say, you know what, I'm going off to Myanmar tomorrow because I want to cover the Rohingya crisis. I'm going off to Saudi Arabia tomorrow. I want to see what's happening with freedom. It's probably hard to do. Do you have colleagues who are reporting from other parts of the world, or less and less as well?
Well, it's a challenge. We have a network of competent religion reporters, stringers, that we rely on a regular basis. But the big news houses don't have a bench of religion reporters, right? They're going to have sports and entertainment and front page in the White House and so on. But I think I won't name names, but some of the big news services simply don't have religion writers, and they approach religion as a secondary component to another topic like immigration. And also because religion's such a technical content, subject matter, I think there's some hesitation for reporters to jump in and write from really a nuanced religious angle. So there are a lot of kind of challenges in good religion reporting. So we have a good network, other organizations have a good network, but good religion reporters are not pervasive in every country.
And if I'm a newspaper or a media consumer in Germany, France, Great Britain, Italy, am I reading in my local papers much religion news?
I don't want to get out over my ski tips, but I would say the amount of religion news, generally is not going to be, high volume. Not going to get a lot of high volume.
I mean, America is a religious country. We probably have more interest, is my guess, than the Europeans do and than most Asian countries do. There's probably less of it there, but I don't know that. I'm asking.
Well, I mean, we have a handful of reporters in Europe that we rely on all the time. Tom Hennigan is one of them, who used to be at Reuters. And so when some of these writers leave big houses, they want to continue to write on the beat. And so we try to pick them up and put them to work.
Sharon, let me turn to you. You've argued that there's great potential for the international religious freedom movement to scale up. I and probably others here are dubious that that's the case. Convince us that there is this potential to scale up, that the challenges are not overwhelming and growing.
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me? No. Thanks. Does this work?
Yeah.
Good. I love this movement, and I think you do too. It is one of the leading human rights movements of the last 20 years, and it had a huge impact in shifting the paradigm on this topic of religious freedom. But friends speak honestly with friends, and I have to say that the movement has waned. And I think it's waned because it did not embrace opportunities for scale up. I'm just thinking about the comparison to the anti-trafficking movement and how that movement went from advocacy to operations and implementation on the ground. I mean, consider the numbers, and I hope this isn't too coarse a comparison, but the anti-trafficking movement addresses about 40 million people a year, and it gets over about $500 million a year from U.S. and other funders governmentally. And then you compare that with the USCIRF movement, which has billions of people suffering under religious persecution, and yet it gets a scintilla of that amount of money. Now, you and I know that talent follows money, and also paradigms are cracked open by operationalizing on the ground, and yet this did not happen. It happened in the trafficking movement because they were able to implement programs and to broadly impact operations on the ground. This did not happen with the religious freedom movement. So I am proposing a couple of things, if I may. I think it's time to create platforms. I think it's time to scale up in a couple of realms. One realm is broadly mobilizing grassroots organizations. I think this can be done by being more intentional through our funding at DRL, for example, creating platforms for activism. I think this is true in creating synergies for genocide mapping, for example, evidence collection from the ground, for prisoner advocacy. for unlocking the advocacy around large groups of prisoners. Frankly, I think that USCIRF could be to prisoner advocacy what Helsinki was in challenging the Soviet Union. I mean, every movement needs an epicenter or platform, and USCIRF is a brilliant little set of activists in an unusual way in the U.S. government. And I want to give a nod to the genius of this organization and this activist-oriented leadership here, and for it to take that next step in prisoner advocacy. I mean, now combine that set of opportunities, those platforms unlocked, with, say, large groups of people mobilized among faiths. We're the most ubiquitous, broadly based volunteer organizations in the world, faith-based groups, right? I mean, we're the best organized groups on the ground in the world among our faith streams, and yet those faith streams have not been tapped. What if we started tapping those, for example, to do advocacy with the U.S. government? For example, Luann Sabatier with our team created the IRF scorecard, the IRF scorecard. It's a static document now that lists all of the legislative initiatives in Congress. But what if that became activated, where on a Sunday or Saturday morning in a 5,000-member congregation, you could send a social media communication to your member of Congress on a piece of legislation. I know on a Monday morning, those members look and see how many people have reached out to them on a particular issue. That's how you get scale, for example. Or why aren't we tapping into missions organizations and teaching them how to do persecution reporting, and then training others on the ground also in persecution context to do the same, and then connecting with Tom and his people and the stringers on the ground to do reporting too. So we're thinking now about mobilizing. We're thinking about a mobilization hub. We're thinking about IRF 2.0, and in this time, this 20-year anniversary, I think we can do it. Basically, I say, people love their religion and they want to take meaningful action on it, and if you connect them with meaningful platforms, they'll move. I say unlock the love.
I'll continue to ask questions, but okay, actually I won't continue to ask questions. I'll start to take yours, and when we have pauses, I'll come back with my other questions. I don't know if we have microphones out here. We do have microphones out here. Excellent. And maybe you just give your, yes, you need to. Hi. Come to the podium. Why don't you do that? I guess that's okay.
Come to the podium?
Oh, so that you can record it better? Is that one there good for you?
Okay.
Come up to this podium, ask your question.
You don't know what you're doing. I'm a lawyer. I'm an activist. You're putting me at a podium? This is very dangerous.
We have Frank Wolf here. We can pull you off if we have to.
Yes, he could. He could do that. My name is Mike Donnelly with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and my question is for Tom. So, press releases. This is a very specific, practical question. Press releases. Good, bad, use them, don't use them. You just complained about getting one every day. I'm trying to figure out what I do with my time to connect with the media to advance all my issues all over the world. Should I be using press releases, and how should I be using them? Can you talk about tools? Can you talk about strategies? Can you talk about how to write them? I mean, I've done some, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
So we have a press release service that goes out to about 3,600 people who are interested in getting press releases on religion. So it's still a viable tool to use press releases. In my role, I can't always act on press releases. I'm happy to spread the word. I would suggest that social media is another way that you can get your press releases distributed to a wider group. So the answer, I would say, without getting waylaid or too specific, but yeah, press releases work. We distribute them. There are a lot of good press release services, the Business Wire, for example. And, being brief to the point is helpful. Well, the question is how many words. There's no magic, but I would say, you know, I would call 400 words plus all your contact information. One of the ways to kind of play off that question that all of you can be helpful to reporters is when you're pitching a story, to keep the social media aspect of the story in mind. In other words, a journalist might want to cover the local rabbi, you know, down the street, but he or she may know that particular story may not play or get as much coverage as an activist trying to fight gun violence or something. So journalists are always trying to weigh the value of storytelling, and they're a competition to get that writer's attention. So I would just say that when you think about pitching stories, keep in mind sort of what the reporter is going to be doing when they pitch their editor about pursuing a particular story. The social media aspect, if you can deliver video and photos with captions and copyright information, you're making the reporter's job a lot easier. So in terms of trying to get people's attention, whether it's press releases or otherwise, kind of look at the big picture of what the reporter's up against in delivering a story on religion.
Want to come up to the mic here, to the podium, and the mic.
Michael Marshall, Global Peace Foundation. Another question for Tom Gallagher. I'm actually a former editor-in-chief of UPI and its more recent online manifestation. So my question is, in the time you've been with the Religion News Service, what changes have you seen in the type of stories that lead and are focused on? I mean, has there been significant shift in where the type of religious news story is coming out, what's being featured most? Thanks.
Thank you. So I joined RNS in November of 16, and so I've been there 15, 16 months. We're going through a lot of changes. We're trying to be responsive to the digital age, breaking news. We have 60 or so media outlets who buy our content. They will tell us, for example, they want pieces of 750 words. That's important to them. You know, we can't lose track of the fact that evangelicals and the current Trump administration, there's a lot of dynamic around the evangelicals, and so that's been a big story. One of the things we're trying to do is not just write about religion as conflict, but religion as a constructive force in communities. And so there's discussion internally about getting those positive stories. And that's one of the things I would encourage all of you, especially as you focus internationally. We need more good stories about pluralism that's thriving, where people of different religious traditions actually enjoy being in community with one another. And so, you know, breaking news is a big deal. The evangelical story around the Trump administration is a big deal. Trying to get shorter, faster news out the door, so 300-word blurbs with a follow-up. I think there's a role for longer form journalism in the 2,000 to 3,000 word range, maybe longer, but that takes time. And so for some of our reporters and others, pursuing a story over many weeks is sort of a drain on the day-to-day, get the news out. So we're constantly balancing those stresses. And then lastly, I would just say that, you know, for the nonprofit news organizations, we're constantly knocking on doors for support. And so for nonprofit, you know, I'm out there raising money, but we're worried about website analytics. We're trying to increase our technology and software usage. Podcasts, videos, you know, all the things that are happening, they affect the religion news reporting as well. And that's why I mentioned, to the extent you can deliver the goods on video and photos, for example, that helps the text writer complete the package.
Barbara.
I just have a quick comment, really, about when we're talking about international religious freedom. You're talking about the fact that there are fewer and fewer journalists in America writing about religion, and really knowledgeable people. I've just come back from Indonesia, and this ties in with a huge problem you have in countries where major religious discrimination exists or is rapidly spreading, and Indonesia would be in the second part of that. I met with the former editor-in-chief of the Jakarta Post, and he said that the way religion is reported in Indonesia is, because it's such a huge country, so far-flung, so many ethnicities and religions, they tend to get in touch with the local imam or priest or, whoever the pandit, whoever it happens to be. That is the first person they reach out to. They're not talking to citizens or eyewitnesses or experts on that region who may understand the conflagration, why was this church burnt down, whatever. So the people who are reporting have no understanding of religion. They have no context in which. So what happens is these stories become very inflammatory. And usually, even if it's a victimized religious minority, they end up coming out looking not good. For example, the Copts in Egypt, the government would not give them a permit for the church, but at the end they were told, you didn't have a permit, you were here illegally, correct? So he said, and I think this is something we can do in the US through either USCIRF or the State Department, is training of journalists in how to cover religion in Indonesia, in Pakistan, in Nigeria. Really, it's an expertise, and it cannot be something done by all purpose. So this is a project that I think would be a great project to do.
I had a chance to travel to Kurdistan with Cardinal Dolan of New York to cover his trip to the displaced Yazidis and Christians. And so last year at one of the USCIRF's meetings, the idea was posed to send a Democrat and Republican congressperson together into a region. And that had a lot of benefits that came out of that. But I would also suggest that when you have these trips, think about bringing a religion reporter along to write about the trip. That doesn't mean you're going to get favorable treatment as an organization, and that would be disclosed. But when you have these in-country trips, bring a U.S. reporter along, and that's a way to integrate them, pave the way for local access, and get coverage of a particular matter. How do you do what? Oh, you just call me up. Not that we have all this money that we're going to send people. I'm just saying, like, that's the dialogue journalism needs to have with people on the ground covering stories abroad.
I'm Mike Gauss.
1 second.
I just wanted to add, because this is really an important topic, because you asked about it before. Media relations for a topic like this cannot be a fire and forget weapon. Right? It can't be firing off a press release and assuming everybody's going to write because in your mind this is a very, very important story. This is a niche issue that, with so many things going on in the world, takes a lot of effort to cultivate relationships with reporters, to pitch stories, to make it newsworthy. And there's a triangle for effective public affairs that you have to follow for an issue like this: politics, policy, and press. You take one piece of that triangle away, you're not going to bring the attention that you want to an issue. You have to have members of Congress involved. You have to have the right policy ideas to address the problem. And that will all create a lot of press attention. And it all feeds off of each other.
I'm afraid have to be the last question, to make it brief and go to the answers. We could talk about this for another hour or two easily, but we have other people. We may not have time for your question afterwards. Yeah.
Sure. Mike Gauss with the Center for Pluralism. My question is to Farhanaz. She mentioned about the misogyny in religious texts. I think it is because most of the religious texts have been written, interpreted by men all along. I can give you a concrete example in Quran. There is one verse where it says, you admonish the woman if she misbehaves, and then you can beat. For 1400 years, that verse was taken as beat. Whereas Dr. Lale Bakhtiar from Chicago University, She interpreted that means separation, not beat. So all the religious texts, there are 60 such verses in Quran that have been deliberately misinterpreted by men. So it's time for women to take this thing and reinterpret holy texts so they are not misogynistic anymore. So my question to you is, what can we do?
Firstly, I don't believe I said there was misogyny in religion. I said there were people who felt that. So I want to be clear, that's not my point of view. Yes, I mean, reforming religious texts, whatever and whichever faith they belong to, is something that the community and leaders of those communities should definitely work on. And not just for women, I would say, to make space for, one of the biggest things, again, in Indonesia, I found everyone was trying to be very kind to people of faith in the room. But whether they were Catholic leaders, they were Protestant leaders, they were Muslim leaders, they were Hindu leaders, they all said atheists, people of no faith, should have no protection. So, it's a more complicated conversation when you get into changing texts or whatever. I just want to be clear, though, I didn't use those words.
Yeah, I apologize. I know there are other questions. I had other questions as well, but let's give a round of applause to the panelists who I think did a great job. And I think we're going to start almost immediately, or you're immediately with Congressman Hultgreen. So thank you. Stay where you are, and appreciate your attention.
Rich, yeah, you too.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, the Congressman's right here.
I'll sit here.
Okay, then I'm over there.
Perfect.
Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, you both.
I go wherever they tell me.
Me too. I've learned that quickly. Yeah. So.
No, but he's a place to sit as well. So in just a couple of minutes, we'll pick us off.
Yes.
A brief introduction, I assume.
Yes.
And then you'll be immediately after.
Perfect.
A brief introduction. If you need to just thank the one who was there from the podium, you continue.
Okay.
So we just gave you a seat just so that you can see.
That's great. That's perfect. Thank you.
Nice to see you.
Okay.
We're good.
Okay.
We're fine. Yeah. Looks good.
Did you need an introduction from each seat?
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe it's to push this perfect. Like the green. Do you want me to do that first?
We can do that. I'll do that.
Okay, if we can gather again, and I'll give you one more minute to get back to your seats. Keep this show going. Where's the rest of my panel? Oh, there they are. Okay, thank you so much. In this panel, we are highlighting individual prisoners of conscience. because it is individual people who suffer the often devastating consequences of unjust laws or practices. It's fairly easy to forget a statistic, but it's harder to forget a face, a real human being. We want these prisoners of conscience to know that they are not forgotten. We want to draw attention to the laws, policies, and practices that led to their imprisonment. We want to hold their governments accountable. Ultimately, we want these and other prisoners of conscience to be freed, and we want to work with you to help ensure that this will happen. USCIRF advocates for these prisoners of conscience loudly and publicly. While private diplomacy often has a role to play, public inattention often can lead to persecution, not freedom. That's why I am so pleased today to highlight two initiatives: USCIRF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience Project and the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. Sorry. I want to now welcome Representative Randy Hultgren, who co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Representative Hultgren from Illinois is a clear, strong, and forceful voice in Congress for human rights and religious freedom. For this, we thank him so much. Please go to the information table or look in your folders for more information on the representative, because if I said all the things he's been involved in, I'm afraid he wouldn't have time to talk. So we are pleased that he can take a few minutes out of his busy schedule to talk with us about the Defending Freedoms Project. This project, a Lantos Commission initiative, was created in collaboration with USCIRF and Amnesty International USA. Through this project, members of Congress advocate in support of prisoners of conscience. Representative Hultgren, thank you again for coming, and we are eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Tom. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your work. It's always so good to see my dear friend, mentor, former chairman, Frank Wolf, and grateful for all that he has done and continues to do, but also just encouraged by this meeting today and really honored to be with you for a few minutes today. And I wish I could spend the whole day with you. They've got a few things for us to do over at the Capitol, so I apologize. I'm going to have to leave and head back. But I do want to say thank you and good morning. And again, thank you for the opportunity to speak about the importance of advocating for prisoners of conscience. My fellow members of Congress and myself are very grateful for the work USCIRF is doing on religious freedom around the world. We regularly rely on your county reports to determine how to best support those who've lost their freedom to worship and express their beliefs according to their conscience. Thank you so much for drawing attention to those who the world otherwise would have forgotten about. In 2012, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, in conjunction with USCIRF and Amnesty International, launched the Defending Freedom Project to help members of Congress advocate for the release of prisoners of conscience around the world. It was really at that time that Congressman Frank Wolf had talked to me about that, and I had taken my first step to adopt a prisoner of conscience and have taken every opportunity to speak up for that person every chance I get. Through the DFP, members of Congress adopt incarcerated prisoners of conscience, highlight the circumstances of their imprisonment, and stand in solidarity with the prisoner through letters, floor speeches, op-eds, and other actions to keep them and their situation in the public eye so that they're not forgotten. The advocacy efforts of members and their staff have often contributed to better prison conditions, the reduction of prison sentences, and even the release. USCIRF's partnership in this endeavor has been invaluable. Your expert staff and commissioners have nominated multiple prisoners to the project incarcerated because of their faith, and you have worked diligently with different congressional offices to find the right advocate for their cases. We've come a long way since the project first began in 2012. Since that time, we've added 4 new partnering organizations that help us to highlight different types of prisoners of conscience in all parts of the world. These include Freedom House, Freedom Now, Reporters Without Borders, and Scholars at Risk. These partners add expertise in specific sectors where governments seek to silence freedom of expression through incarceration. We can continue to grow the project together, but there's still so much more for us to do. One thing that's become clear to me through the DFP is that being a prisoner of conscience doesn't necessarily end with release from prison. As I mentioned, I first adopted my prisoner of conscience in 2013, and I've been advocating ever since then for Chinese human rights defender and prisoner of conscience Zhu Yufu. On March 4th of this year, Zhu was released from prison after completing a 7-year term on baseless charges of subverting state power for publishing a poem. However, Zhu remains deprived of his political rights and is under a travel ban and has limited access to much-needed medical care. In short, he's under house arrest, but not in that name. This kind of predicament, along with rearrest shortly after release, is all too common for prisoners of conscience around the world. We need to make sure that advocacy for these people extends beyond literal imprisonment and goes to the heart of their right to express their conscience without any form of reprisal or limits on their freedom. So again, we are so grateful for your partnership. I'm hoping my good friend and co-chairman Jim McGovern will be able to make it over as well. I know he's in the markup right now in the Agriculture Committee with the Farm Bill and has some important points that I know that he is involved with that. So I hope he'll be able to make it. But if not, I want you to know that we are a team, that we are so proud to be co-chairman, that the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission continues the great bipartisan work that really was from its founding of coming together, caring about the responsibility we have to speak up for those who are being persecuted or imprisoned because of their faith, because of their beliefs, and doing all that we can to advocate on their behalf. So I just again want to thank you, look forward to working together in support of religious freedom, and if we can be helpful in any way, please let us know. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Congressman. If I could just ask you one additional question. You've laid out how the program is working right now. How would you like to see it grow, and how can USCIRF and the people in this room help you with this project?
Well, thank you. Where we do need to see it grow is just getting more members engaged. Again, Co-Chairman McGovern and I have been doing everything we can. We just had a hearing with the Tom Lantos Commission a couple of weeks ago talking about the Defending Freedom Project. And even out of that, we've seen a new step of some new members who have adopted prisoners of conscience. It makes a difference. Our biggest challenge is everything else. This is important work, but with all of the other the volume of information, the crisis of the day that it seems like we have over on Capitol Hill, it's a challenge for us to get attention of members of Congress and get a commitment. We're not asking for huge amounts of time, but just this commitment to speak up at least once or twice or 3 or 4 times throughout the year, to be able to speak up for someone who really is not able to have their voice heard, but for a member of Congress being able to do it. So I think our biggest challenge is connection. And so I would just say, if you have a member of Congress that we could follow up with that you think would be interested in this, we will do that. We do have a good number of members of the House who have adopted prisoners, but we also have many more prisoners who have not been adopted yet. So that's our biggest challenge, I think, is continuing to reach out, to add to our numbers, knowing that this does make a difference, that this is very important work. Sometimes we don't feel the urgency of it, but certainly these prisoners and their families feel the urgency of it. And so if you can help us with that, if you can let us know those that you have a chance to talk to who you think, hey, this might be a good person to bring into this program. For me, it was that first step of really seeing that it makes a difference. And we have a responsibility, certainly as a nation, but also of members of the House and the Senate, to use this role, this platform that we have to take every opportunity to be the voice for those who sometimes feel like they're being forgotten, and we can never let that happen. The other thing we're continuing to work on, Co-Chairman McGovern and I have recently co-sponsored House Resolution 750 to have a Prisoners of Conscience Day. That would be year after year after year. That, again, just another opportunity for us to highlight, to come together, something that, that does work, that does make a difference. And reminding my colleagues that there's so many frustrations and so many things that divide us, but this opportunity to fight for human rights and freedom of all people is something that can bring us together. So I think those are our requests. Please stay in touch with us. Jamie from my staff is amazing. If he or I can ever be of help, and I would just say, especially, you know, just if you have a chance to meet up with someone, maybe it's your member of Congress or someone that you're able to run into and talk with a little bit, and sense that this might be a person that would be a good target for us to go after, we will follow up and hopefully get them signed up. So I think that's our biggest challenge. We've seen good progress, but we also see the need and the demand for more people to adopt prisoners of conscience. Unfortunately, these prisoners increase in numbers, and we need to do everything we can to make sure we're increasing our numbers of our members of the House as well. So again, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for letting me stop by for a few minutes. And if we can work together in any way, and even if it just has an impact on one life, it's all worth it. I think we can have impact on multiple lives, but it is this vital necessity for us to lock arms, to be brainstorming, to be doing all that we can to hold other leaders and countries and governments responsible and accountable for what they're doing. And we've seen that it resonates, that they are paying attention. And so that is encouraging. So thank you so much. Keep up the great work, and look forward to working together as well.
Thank you so much, Representative. Thank you. Thank you so much, Representative, for this commitment to this very important project and for spending some time with us today. So let's now return to USCIRF's Religious Prisoners of Conscience project. We have a lot more information about this at our website, uscirf.gov. That you can check out and see all of the prisoners that we are sponsoring and the commissioners who are working for these individual prisoners. I also encourage you to pick up the material on the table over there, which highlights these prisoners of conscience cases. I myself have been advocating for the Eritrean Orthodox Patriarch, Abune Antonios. Commissioner Clifford May has been advocating for Raif Badawi, whom the Saudi Arabian government has imprisoned. Our chairman, Daniel Mark, is working for Abdul Shakur, imprisoned by the government of Pakistan. And today, USCIRF's commissioners Tenzin Dorji and Jackie Walcott and Vice Chairman Christina Arriaga will talk about other prisoners of conscience in our project. We are also extremely pleased that Pastor Win Kong Chin, who was detained in Vietnam and for whom Commissioner Jackie Walcott had advocated, is with us today in freedom. We look forward to also hearing from him. I tell Jackie that often that if I'm ever in prison, I want her to be my advocate. She's just terrific at this. So let me turn over now to Commissioner Dorji.
Thank you, Father Rees. Good morning. I speak today on behalf of two prisoners of conscience, one Tibetan and one Uyghur. The Chinese government has persecuted them both as it relentlessly attacks the rights, cultures, and identities of Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghur Muslims. For these and other actions, USCIRF has recommended and State Department has continued to designate China as a country of particular concern. The Tibetan is Gyintin Shöji Nyima. The Chinese government disappeared him in 1995, shortly after His Holiness the Dalai Lama identified him as the Panchen Lama, the second highest position in Tibetan Buddhism. He and his family have not been heard from since. The government has denied international observers' requests to visit him and installed its own choice for the 11th Panchen Lama in November 1995. Most Tibetan Buddhists have rejected their choice and the government's inappropriate intrusion into Tibetan Buddhism. Later this month, on April 25th, Gyintin Shöji Nyima will be celebrating his 29th birthday. Please join me in wishing him a happy birthday. Each passing day without the legitimate Panchen Lama is a day of sadness for Tibetan Buddhists. I ask China for videographic evidence of his well-being. Through my resolute advocacy, I hope to spread the story of the Panchen Lama and live to see the day when Tibetans can see him freely enjoy the responsibilities of his righteous office. But we have much to do, given that the Chinese government has turned Tibet into a police state in its attempt to control and even sinicize Tibetan Buddhism. To that end, the government detains and tortures Tibetan Buddhist prisoners of conscience and destroyed large portions of Larungar, Yarchingar, and other Tibetan Buddhist places of learning and worship. In reaction to almost complete securitization of Tibetan areas of China and the difficulty of even the most minimal kinds of protests, more than 152 Tibetans have self-immolated for religious freedom and the return of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to Tibet. Please join me in the quest for justice for Gyintin Shöji Nyima and other prisoners of conscience such as Tashi Wangchu, the Tibetan language activist, and the Tibetan Buddhist people. I also ask you in the name of Vice Chairwoman of the Commission, Sandra Jolie, who could not be here today, to seek justice for Gulmira Yimin, a Uyghur Muslim web administrator. The Chinese government sentenced her to life in prison on April 1st, 2010, on charges of splitism, leaking state secrets, and organizing an illegal demonstration. Gulmira says that she was tortured, forced to sign documents she hadn't read while in pretrial detention, and denied access to her lawyer until the time of trial. In reality, Ms. Yimin's only crime was her leadership in the Uyghur community and participation in protests on July 5, 2009, which decried the killings of Uyghur migrant workers. As Gulmira Yimin remains in prison, the human rights and religious freedom conditions for the Uyghur Muslim community is getting much worse. The Chinese government bans Uyghurs praying and possessing religious materials in their own homes and observing Ramadan, prohibits children under 18 going to mosques, regularly confiscate religious materials, and seeks to limit the use of Uyghur language. The government also uses GPS tracking systems, facial and iris recognition, DNA sampling, and voice pattern sampling to target Uyghur Muslims. It also has rounded up Uyghur Muslims and forced them into re-education camps. The Chinese government should release Gulmira Yimin. USCIRF will work on her behalf until they do. I hope you will join us to also that the Chinese government releases other Uyghur prisoners of conscience, including Ilham Tohti. There's much we can do in freedom to help these and other prisoners of conscience achieve freedom. Now I would like to introduce Vice Chairwoman Ariaka, who speaks on behalf of Pastor Andrew Brunson and the most venerable Thich Quang To.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dorji. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay, thank you. I'm always hopeful that this panel will be canceled right before I step on because all of the prisoners were released. In particular, I was hopeful not to have to talk about Pastor Andrew Brunson today. Earlier this week, he went to trial, and the US government was hoping that he would come back with Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, and Senator Tillis, who flew to Izmir just to attend his hearing. Regrettably, he faces another hearing on May 7th. Last year, Vice Chairwoman Sandra Jolly and I went to Izmir, to the prison of Kiriklar, where we visited with Pastor Andrew Brunson. He is accused of participating in the Gulenist movement. He's accused of assisting Kurds. The proof, evidence, secret testimony, and a photograph his daughter texted of a popular rice and meat dish in the Middle East, which was then termed by the Turkish government as a Gulenist delicacy. When we met with Pastor Brunson, he was clearly dislocated from reality. He stays 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in his cell. Doesn't leave to go eat, he doesn't leave to go exercise. The only chances he has to leave his cell are to see his wife or the consular officer, and most of the time that is done through a plexiglass window. The room where Vice Chairwoman Jolly and I sat had a formica table. We had left all of our belongings outside. We were only allowed to bring in 3 sheets of paper, and there was a pen attached to the formica table that we could share with Pastor Brunson to take notes or write notes to other people in the outside world. He's the only Christian, the only English speaker, and the only American in that prison. We call for his immediate release. We call for the Turkish government to cease this despicable game of hostage diplomacy. And we call for the US government to apply strong measures to the government of Turkey, including targeted sanctions. No Turkish official, no Turkish government official should be able to come here and shop for Christmas while Pastor Andrew Brunson is still in prison. No one involved in his detention should be allowed into this country. I also want to highlight another prisoner of conscience, Thich Quang Do. Thich Quang Do is the 5th Supreme Patriarch of the United Buddhist Church of Vietnam. He is 90 years old. He has spent 33 years of those 90 years in isolation, either through imprisonment or house arrest. He is currently in a monastery where he doesn't even have the key to the gate to the first floor. He's constantly watched by police. If he is allowed to leave his room and come downstairs, all microphones and all audiovisual equipment is turned off, so he's unable to preach to his own Buddhist congregants. His crime? In 1997, he organized humanitarian relief assistance for individuals who were suffering from a flood in China. And his crime continues to be living according to his religious beliefs. His mistreatment characterizes the treatment of Vietnam for all religious people there. We call for the State Department to designate Vietnam as a CPC, a country of particular concern, for systematic, egregious, and ongoing human rights violations. I will now turn to my fellow commissioner, Ambassador Jackie Wolcott. Thank you.
That one works anyway.
That one works, too.
Thank you, Vice Chair Arriaga. Am I coming through? I have a happier story to tell, I'm happy to say. You'll note all the pictures behind us. One picture that's not up there is Pastor Win Kon Chin, because he, as mentioned, is here with us today, as is his son, Tung. And it's a happy story because he is now out of prison, but it didn't start out that way. Pastor Chin was imprisoned in Vietnam, and his wife, Tran Thi Hong, was abused horribly by the Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese government released Pastor Chin from prison last July 28th, almost 6 years before his prison sentence ended. The government, however, released him on condition that he immediately leave Vietnam. He and his family now reside in the United States in freedom, and we're thrilled to have them here. We at USCIRF are deeply honored to have him with us today, and also Dr. Tong, who is CEO and President of Boat People SOS. Dr. Tong will translate today for Pastor Chin. And Dr. Tong himself is an amazing, impassioned advocate who deserves our gratitude and support for all the work he's done over many years on behalf of human rights in Vietnam and promoting religious freedom throughout Southeast Asia. Pastor Chin.
Thank you.
If that one doesn't work, I'll give you this one. That one's
Kính chào quý vị. Nhân dịp 20 năm kỷ niệm Nghị hội Tự do Tôn giáo Hoa Kỳ, tôi thay mặt cho gia đình và Hiệp hội PBAF gửi tới lời cầu nguyện và chúc mừng tốt đẹp trong các thành viên đang có mặt ở đây.
On behalf of the Vietnamese People's Evangelical Fellowship, I pray for all participants in today's summit marking the 20th anniversary of USCIRF and wish you all the best.
Qua đây tôi cảm ơn dân biểu Alan Lantos, dân biểu Esroy, dân biểu P. Bonse lên tiếng làm giảm đi sự đàn áp và tra tấn khi tôi còn đang ở trong tù.
I take this occasion to thank Congressman Alan Lantos, Congressman Ed Royce, Congressman Bill Posey, whose voices resulted in a reduction in mistreatment and torture while I was in prison.
Tôi cũng cảm ơn sự can thiệp của Bộ Ngoại giao Hoa Kỳ, Ủy hội Tự do Tôn giáo Hoa Kỳ để Công an Việt Nam chấm dứt cuộc tra tấn kéo dài 2 tháng đối với vợ tôi là bà Trần Thị Hồng.
I'm also grateful to the State Department and USCIRF for ending the 2-month-long torture of my wife just because she had met with the State Department delegation on my behalf in April 2016.
Chỉ vì cô ấy gặp phái đoàn Bộ Ngoại giao Hoa Kỳ để cầu cứu cho tôi, nhờ áp lực quốc tế và chế độ Cộng sản Việt Nam trả tự do cho tôi với nhiều điều kiện, gia đình tôi phải lưu vong.
All she did was to meet with the State Department delegation to ask for my freedom and my release from prison.
Tôi đặc biệt cảm ơn cựu đại sứ David Ten và ủy viên Jackie Watts và linh mục Thomas G và Ủy ban Nhân quyền Tom Lantos.
Thanks to that intervention from the State Department and USCIRF, I have been released and allowed to leave Vietnam, but we, our family and myself, had to stay in exile. I would like to express my particular thanks to Ambassador David Saperstein, Commissioner Jackie Walcott, and Father Thomas Rees, and the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission.
Và ở đây chúng tôi muốn nói chính quyền Việt Nam đàn áp một người để khủng bố nhiều người phải sợ.
The Vietnamese government has a policy to persecute a few in order to intimidate many.
Khi chính quyền Việt Nam đàn áp và áp lực quốc tế lên tiếng thì họ thả một tù nhân thì họ bắt lại nhiều người khác.
Under the international pressure, Vietnamese government may release one prisoner of conscience now, but then they would detain many others dissidents afterwards.
Đây là chính sách hai mặt mà Cộng sản Việt Nam thường áp dụng.
This is a two-pronged policy usually used by the Vietnamese government.
Sau khi tôi được trả tự do hồi tháng 7 năm ngoái, họ đã bắt hàng loạt những người trong các vụ án Hội Anh em Dân Chủ.
After my release last July, the government of Vietnam has since arrested and prosecuted several members of the Brotherhood for Democracy.
Họ bắt một số người trong cái vụ án bom Misa ở Nghệ Tĩnh.
They have arrested protesters who protested against ecological disaster caused by the Formosa steel plant in Hà Tĩnh province.
Rồi vụ ông Bùi Văn Trung, vụ ông Vương Văn Thả là những tín đồ hòa hảo ở An Giang gần đây.
And Mr. Bùi Văn Trung and several of his fellow Hòa hảo Buddhists, including Mr. Vương Văn Thả recently.
Và gần đây họ bắt 12 người thượng ở Tây Nguyên. Chỉ trong 2 tuần qua, 9 tù nhân lương tâm bị xử tổng cộng 83 năm tù và 30 năm quản chế.
And very recently, they arrested 12 Montagnard Christians in the Central Highlands. In just the past 2 weeks alone, the regime sentenced 9 human rights defenders to a total of 83 years of imprisonment, followed by 30 years of house arrest.
Theo danh sách của People SOS, Việt Nam hiện có khoảng 170 tù nhân lương tâm. Do đó là đa phần là tù nhân tôn giáo. Xin xem tài liệu đặt ở bảng thông tin.
According to BPSS record, there's now about 170 prisoners of conscience, mainly religious prisoners, and there's handouts on these prisoners at the information table.
Các tù nhân tôn giáo và chính trị bị đối xử tệ hơn tù hình sự.
In Vietnam's prison, prisoners of conscience fare worse than common criminals.
Thường xuyên bị biệt giam, thực phẩm rất là kém, nước uống có vôi phèn, không được chăm sóc y tế, không được viết thư cho gia đình.
They are subjected to several measures such as solitary confinement, bad food, impure drinking water, no access to medical care, denied correspondence with family.
Không được ra ngoài sinh hoạt tập thể và nhiều hạn chế khác. Nhiều người sau khi ra khỏi tù 6 tháng hoặc vài năm đã chết vì bệnh.
Prohibition from social activities with other inmates and many other restrictions. Several former prisoners died from ill health within a few years after being released.
Số tù nhân lương tâm bị tra tấn hoặc bị đầu độc đến chết từ năm 2000 đến nay là khoảng 127 người. Nhiều nhất là người thượng Tây Nguyên, Hờ Mông Tây Bắc và người Khmer Krom ở Tây Nam Bộ.
Since 2000, approximately 127 prisoners of conscience have died from torture or contamination of food or water, with most victims being Montagnard Christians from the Central Highlands, Hmong Christians from the northwestern region, and Khmer Krom Buddhists from southwestern region of Vietnam.
Chính phủ Hoa Kỳ cần tăng áp lực ngoại giao và áp dụng các biện pháp chỉ định CBC và chế tài theo luật của Magnitsky toàn cầu để thúc đẩy Hà Nội phóng thích tất cả những tù nhân lương tâm.
The United States should increase diplomatic pressure and use CPC designation and the global Magnitsky law sanctions to pressure Hanoi to release all prisoners of conscience.
Đồng thời tôi cũng kêu gọi các dân biểu Hoa Kỳ nhận bảo trợ những tù nhân lương tâm để bảo vệ tính mạng, ngăn chặn các biện pháp tra tấn, nhục hình và để gia đình của người tù được đi thăm nuôi, được chuyển thông tin ra ngoài.
I also urge members of Congress to adopt prisoners of conscience so as to increase their chance of survival by preventing torture and other forms of persecution, and to advocate for their family members to be allowed to visit them in prison.
Và trong hội nghị này tôi nhấn mạnh rằng tình trạng tôn giáo và nhân quyền tại Việt Nam bị đàn áp lên cấp độ cao rất là tồi tệ.
And at this summit, I like to emphasize the fact that Vietnam is increasing its persecution against religions.
Đặc biệt là những vụ vừa rồi là ông Hứa Phi, Hòa thượng Thích Không Tánh và những cái vị Phật giáo ở An Giang.
Especially targeting the Cao Đài religious leaders and Buddhist leaders.
Dạ, xin cảm ơn.
Thank you very much.
Tôi muốn có món quà.
Thank you, Pastor Chen. As usual, he was humble and spoke mostly about others' situations, and there are so many. But if I could just add a few facts about his own case. The Vietnamese government sentenced Pastor Chin to 11 years in prison for, quote, undermining national solidarity, unquote. What this longtime pro-democracy and religious freedom advocate actually did was minister to his congregants, mostly Montagnards, in the Central Highlands, ignoring the Vietnamese government's ban on preaching there. For that, he was imprisoned, physically and verbally abused, and spent about a month in solitary confinement with his health rapidly deteriorating. As Vice Chairwoman Arriaga earlier stressed, as did the pastor, the Vietnamese government is relentlessly targeting religious individuals and organizations. Its actions do not bode well for the implementation of Vietnam's new law on belief and religion, which became effective January 1st of this year. It includes mandatory government approvals, increased government control, and new punishments for violators. And then there are the so-called red flag militant groups, pro-government mobs that harass Catholics. USCIRF long has called for Vietnam to be designated a country of particular concern, and we still do. Yet, given all this, Pastor Chin was released early. Why? I think we on USCIRF believe that advocacy of many people made a big difference, and that would include the congressman that you mentioned, Representative Lowenthal, Royce, Posey, others in Congress, the State Department, several human rights organizations and NGOs like Boat People SOS, Ambassador at the time, Ambassador at Large David Saperstein, personally advocated, excuse me, for him. And as he mentioned, Ambassador Saperstein insisted on meeting with his wife while visiting Vietnam, for which she was abused horribly by the government. USCIRF and I also worked on his behalf, and I encourage you to look at our website for more details on that. I'd also like to add that there were a lot of prayers going on behalf of Pastor Chin. If I could also just mention briefly, and then I'll turn to Judy Golub, all the work of our senior policy analyst, Tina Mufford, on this case of Pastor Chin and for prisoners and for advocacy throughout the Asian area. So thank you for that, Tina. And let me turn it over now to, did you want to say something more, Pastor?
Oh, he has a small souvenir to recognize and express his gratitude to you and USCIRF.
Oh. Yeah. This was not in the script.
Yes. So this is a plaque, that he'd like to present to you as an expression of gratitude, not only to you, Jackie Wolcott, but also to USCIRF.
Oh, thank you so much. Wow. Judy Golub is going to talk to us about what further action we can take. Thank you. Sure. It's the only one that works.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and I hope you agree at this point in time that working in support of prisoners of conscience needs to be a key part of any IRFA Plus advocacy strategy. Now, such efforts, I think, must be based on solid knowledge about the prisoner, consultation with legal advisors if they have any, and knowledge about the country in which they are imprisoned. After that, what we do as advocates is limited only by our energy and our imagination. So as Sharon suggested, now is the time to go. So for me, such advocacy includes about 7 activities. Let me talk about them briefly. One is working with members of Congress. Members of Congress are great advocates and can be great advocates for prisoners of conscience. They have a huge bully pulpit and they are able to bring attention to these prisoners at the highest levels. We need to work more with them. We need to use the Defending Freedoms Project as well. And again, I'd like to thank Mr. Hultgren for being here today, for his work on the project, for his support for Zhu Yufu, and for Representative McGovern, who is taking on 3 cases. He is working in support of the Panchen Lama, he is working in support of Nabil Rajab from Bahrain, and he's working in support of Raif Badawi from Saudi Arabia. It's a great place to work on those issues. 2, actively support legislation that impacts prisoners of conscience. Representative Hultgren mentioned one of them, the Expressing Support for a Prisoner of Conscience Day, and another one is Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act. Both of those bills are on the table. I think if you start moving them on the Hill and other issues and through appropriations, it's great to draw attention to these issues. 3, urge the State Department and the Ambassador at Large to raise the cases of these prisoners, as well as UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. And ask members of Congress when they go on CODELs to raise these prisoners' cases, ask to meet with them, ask to meet with their family, and ask to meet with community members. 4, give information to members of Congress and the administration. Give them information about bad actors who should be sanctioned under global Magnitsky or other measures. And I have one candidate today. I would recommend Zhen Guangguo as Tibet's party secretary. He perfected 21st century persecution in his targeting of Tibetans. And guess what he is doing right now? In 2017, he became the leader of Xinjiang and is perfecting his harsh tactics there against the Uyghurs. We need to call him out. 5, develop coalitions at the local, state, and national level in support of these prisoners. Prisoners of conscience are a great advocacy tool to highlight both their cases and country conditions. Coalitions allow you to build a community through which local officials, student associations, houses of worship, civic organizations, and everybody else can work together, building trust and relationships that can endure over time. And those enduring relationships are what is key, I think, to successfully work on an issue. 6, use traditional and new media to highlight these cases. Look for hooks, a birthday, an anniversary, so significant hooks in that person's life or in the life of the country. Now, anyone who knows me knows I love swag. Create virtual and actual materials to keep these prisoners' cases and their faces in the public sphere. Statistics can be forgotten. A person's face is harder to forget. Finally, 7, it's really important to train your field, especially about coalition building and best practices to work with members of Congress, the administration, officials, and the media. So unfortunately, these days, it seems to me that prisoners of conscience are a growth industry, be they among the prisoners we've talked about today, or Christians in Sudan, Scientologists in Russia, Shia in Bahrain, Ahmadis in Pakistan, and so many others in too many places. They make our work all the more important, and I thank you for coming today.
I think after hearing from our distinguished panel, I think you can see very clearly the need to shine a light on prisoners of conscience and to advocate to improve their conditions and ultimately to get them freed. Focusing on people makes concrete and understandable the impact of these unjust laws. We can be numbed by the large number of people and events that seem to be beyond our control. But we can understand and feel compelled to work on behalf of an imprisoned religious leader, a disappeared child, a young man or woman tortured by an unjust government. and others whose freedom ruthlessly has been taken away. So I think with our hearts and minds, let's advocate for these and other prisoners of conscience. Now, despite what the clocks on the walls say, we don't have an hour and 10 minutes. We only have 10 more minutes. So if people would like to ask questions now, we're open for a few questions. Please make them brief so that we can get in as many questions as possible. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Enada from International Committee on Nigeria. My question is, would USCIRF consider advocating for prisoners of conscience by non-state actors? I think particularly about Leah Sharibu by Boko Haram in Nigeria, and what can we do to advocate for her with various US government officials? Thank you.
Yes, we are looking into that whole question of advocating for prisoners of conscience by non-state actors. This is a new topic that we are looking into. We are now looking not just at countries of particular concerns, but also, what's the initials now? Entities, EPCs, entities of particular concern. This is a new designation that we are looking at, and thank you for raising that issue because it's one that I think is very important. More questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for a wonderful summit and really important information that you've imparted today. My name is David Adams. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer, and I represent an organization that I'll tell you about privately that supports, among other countries, supports Catholic and evangelical church activities, mainly in the humanitarian field. And I want to talk about Vietnam briefly, because what I'm about to tell you, I think, represents hope about what is being done at the grassroots level, not just by organizations like ours, but others, where in one case, for example, we are supporting an order of nuns, also won't mention them specifically, who have been carrying out amazing work in the south of Vietnam. As some of you probably know, and I know Pastor Chin knows, the government of Vietnam is very restrictive about religious education, and therefore the Catholic Church or other private organizations and churches are not allowed to do formal education. But where they have their influence is in after-school activities. And in this one case, literally thousands of young people, university and high school graduates, have been instructed in the faith in such programs. And I've visited South Vietnam a number of times myself and have really been taken with the passion and the fervor of both those who are doing the instruction as well as the students who are practicing the faith low-key, behind the scenes, but they are believers. So that is one way to support the growth of the church in other religions as well, I imagine, is at the grassroots level and getting to the young people. And as I said, thousands of young people over the years have been influenced and taught in this one program that I'm mentioning.
Thank you for that contribution. Vietnam is a country that we have taken very serious look at, and again, kudos to Tina, who also follows this extremely well. The situation in Vietnam, of course, is much better than it was right at the end of the war. Things have improved, but not enough. And that's what we continue to advocate. And it's a very mixed situation depending on what part of the country you're in. The area where the pastor was working is extremely difficult for Christians to do evangelization or to do work. Whereas in the cities, you can see churches full of people in the cities. I think what we have here is a situation where the government just is a government that doesn't want any voices heard except its own. I'll tell you a funny story about the education and the sisters. The sisters were allowed to do pre-school work and have those. And what we discovered was that the Communist Party officials were all sending their kids to the preschool programs run by the sisters because, of course, they were the best programs. We see this kind of mixed view, but what is very disconcerting is the rise of this red flag group, which is extra legal, basically a gang of people used by the government to harass religious people so that they can, oh, it wasn't us, it wasn't police, wasn't us, don't blame us, but they're the ones who are supporting these people and encouraging them and doing nothing to stop them. So Vietnam, although it has made progress, has got a long ways to go, and we're going to keep on them until they do improve. Sure.
Thưa quý vị, chính quyền Việt Nam thường áp dụng chính sách hai mặt để đàn áp tôn giáo và vi phạm nhân quyền.
The Vietnamese government uses a two-pronged policy to cope with the international criticism.
Một mặt thì ví dụ như chùa Bảy Đính ở Ninh Bình, họ nói đó là có tự do tôn giáo.
For instance, they point to a government-sanctioned Buddhist temple that they allow to operate and said that, see, there's religious freedom.
Ví dụ như là năm ngoái có 2 cuộc truyền giảng ở Hà Nội và Sài Gòn, họ nói đó là có tự do tôn giáo.
There are two very massive gathering of prayers in the Protestant church in Saigon and Hanoi, and they pointed to those events as proof of religious freedom.
Trong khi đó thì nhiều nhà thờ và nhiều tổ chức tôn giáo ở vùng cao như Tây Nguyên, Tây Bắc, Tây Nam Bộ thì bị đàn áp rất là nặng nề.
But at the same time, there are many churches in the Central Highlands that have been severely suppressed.
Bây giờ dẫn chứng như là cái Hội đồng Liên tôn ở Việt Nam, cái tổ chức Phật giáo, Cao đài, Hòa hảo, Tin lành và cả Công giáo ở Nghệ An, chúng ta thấy những hình ảnh và những chứng cứ là cái cách của Cộng sản Việt Nam đàn áp tôn giáo ở tại Việt Nam.
For instance, the way the Interfaith Council in Vietnam was treated, the way that the Cao đài, the Hòa hảo Buddhist churches are treated, and especially the communities in Nghệ An province, those are the Catholic parishes, the way they are treated, then you can tell whether there's freedom of religion or not.
Và chúng ta nói rằng Cộng sản Việt Nam đàn áp tôn giáo và vi phạm nhân quyền có cái tính chuyên nghiệp.
And the persecution by the Vietnamese government takes on a professional nature.
Như vừa rồi họ bắt 12 người thượng ở cái vùng tỉnh Gia Lai và Kon Tum. Họ bắt nhưng không thông báo cho thân nhân gia đình biết.
Just very recently, the government arrested 12 Montagnard Christians in the province of Gia Lai and Kon Tum, but they didn't notify their families.
Và hiện tại thì chúng tôi cũng đang theo dõi cái tình trạng của 12 người thượng này sẽ bị giam giữ như thế nào.
We are trying to find out about the status and the conditions of these Montagnard Christians.
Và ở đây tôi muốn nói thêm là có một cái tổ chức tôn giáo, người ta bắt hết tất cả những người lãnh đạo, người ta xóa sổ luôn cái tổ chức tôn giáo đó.
And there's one religious community, one religion, where the government arrested all the leaders and imprisoned them all.
Đó là vụ án Bia Sơn Ân Đàn Địa Đạo của ông Phan Văn Thu.
And that is the Ân Đàn Đại Đạo Buddhist sect of where the co-founder is Mr. Phan Văn Thu.
Và người lãnh đạo của tổ chức này phải lãnh cái án chung thân và hiện bây giờ bệnh tình rất là nặng nề ở trong trại giam Gia Trung, Gia Lai.
And he is now under life imprisonment and he suffers many diseases and illnesses.
Và chính sách hai mặt của người cộng sản khi thả một người thì sẽ bắt lại nhiều người.
And whenever the government releases one person, they would arrest many others.
Một mặt bên này thì đàn áp nhưng một mặt bên kia thì nói là có tự do.
And on the one hand, they suppress independent religions, but on the other hand, they shore up their own state-sanctioned churches and use it as proof of religious freedom.
Cho nên chúng ta có thể nói rằng đừng tin những gì Cộng sản nói.
So we cannot trust the Vietnamese Communist government.
Nhưng hãy nhìn kỹ những gì người Cộng sản làm.
We should not listen to what they say, but we have to observe what they are doing.
Bản thân tôi đã 27 năm hoạt động tôn giáo mà bị đánh đập tù đầy rất nhiều, tôi kinh nghiệm qua điều đó.
I'm telling you this from my 27 years of experience of being beaten, persecuted, tortured, and imprisoned.
Nguyện xin Chúa sẽ ban phước hết thảy quý vị và xin trân trọng cảm ơn đã lắng nghe.
I thank you very much and pray God to bless you all.
Thank you, Pastor Chan. Our next panel will include Senator Langford, who is running late. So we're going to take a break right now. I'm
so sorry.
Oh.
Can we ask his son to stand up?
Oh, yes.
Tortured because of his father's imprisonment.
Tùng đứng dậy.
Đừng nói nữa.
Đứng dậy thôi.
No, quite all right, Christina. Thank you for doing that. We'll take a short break right now, but stay close because we will begin as soon as Senator Langford gets here. He's on his way.
Hôm nay hả? Tí đưa.
Okay.
Anna muốn
Yeah, I know. No, we went to the same meeting.
Thank you for helping me out, passing a cup of the microphone. I'm going to be doing the verbatim.
Oh, really?
Oh, okay.
I noticed you had some written remarks.
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that possible?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
There
Just,
were so many names there.
in fact, here.
Oh, bless
You have.
Thank you so much.
This is what you
And
really
I'll
need.
I'll be transcribing from the recording, but
This
that's
is
just.
this is everybody on this panel.
Thank you so much.
As far as I'm concerned, just
Right.
do
That's
exactly
right.
what's here
That's
for
right.
me.
Yes.
Don't worry about what I have.
And we just talk about meetings getting together. Definitely.
Hi. How are you? Oh,
No,
wonderful.
he's right there.
He's standing right there.
Okay, sure.
Sure.
Oh, sure.
Just please.
And tell you more.
It's the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, of which I'm a member, is very concerned about the religious freedom situation in Vietnam. We acknowledge that there are huge improvements in Vietnam since the end of the Vietnam War. However, the government needs to improve dramatically. There is still violence against religious people, especially in the mountain areas, in the Central Highlands. There is heavy regulation of religious groups, heavy requirements for registering new church groups. This simply should not happen. And finally, we're very concerned about these groups that the government uses to inflict violence on religious people. This is just very, very bad. The government, uses these games to attack religious people, so it can say, "Oh, it wasn't the police, wasn't us." Well, I'm sorry. We know that these groups are supported by the government, are instructed by the government what to do, and this has got to stop. And finally, we're very concerned about the prisoners of conscience, people who have been imprisoned and tortured by the Vietnamese government. These people need to be freed and allowed to go about their lives. How's that? Is that good? Thank you. Thank you so much.
We have 27 years of being beaten.
Yeah. And, you know, we still only have a picture of that child, you know, and he's in his 20s now. Well-deserved plaque. Well-deserved.
Yeah, but it's really nice. Did you see it?
Yes, I did. It was back now. Oh, that's perfect. I'll pay for it.
Do you want to see?
Well done. Oh, hi. Good to see you.
So nice.
Uh-huh.
I'm going to put I can do this for you. It's really amazing.
Hindu organizations.
Okay.
Because they're still tied with the state government in India.
Ah, okay.
So they can get visas for commissioners to find the team.
Yeah, yeah.
If you choose this round, it is a relief. If not, you can work on it. There's no need to wait for it.
Okay, yeah. Oh, terrific. Well, thank you for that. I'm only on the commission one more month. So, but I know that, you know, mention this to the staff, and they'll be very happy to hear that you're working on this. This has been a desire for years for us to get into India.
I'm also going to reach out to the public that is Hindus and Indians in the U.S. to support Center.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
What is EPC?
Entities of particular concern. These are, well, it's basically ISIS. It's a non-state actor. Now, the second requirement is, though, it has to control a geographical space. Yeah. So there are lots of other groups that I thought would be nice, and then they explained to me, no, they have to control a geographical. So if Boko Haram, ISIS, there's only a few of them, and ISIS no longer even. No. See, because it does. I was saying, you and I were thinking along the same line. No, there's the requirement that they have to have a geographical control of a geographical territory. For example, ISIS will soon no longer qualify because they're, you know, and it's not clear whether Boko Haram now qualifies. You know, so it's a funny. You know, but that's the way it's defined in the legislation, so we have nothing to do with controlling that definition.
So they're intangibles.
Yeah. Otherwise, I think we'd have a long list.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, sure.
It's okay. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I know some, but I'm not going to be helpful. Have you met him? Yes. She's here a few minutes ago. She's our director for international policy, and she's, as I said, she's looking at our policy program and that's what I know she's here. I just saw her. She was standing here. Yeah, it's nice to meet you too. You don't have a, oh, you do? Good. Thank you. Sure. Sure, I'll make sure it gets to the right place. Okay, thank you. Why don't you do him by the side?
We haven't actually where he is.
He's not coming, so but he's gonna Langford's not coming. So we're gonna try to call him. So we're gonna get started. We're gonna try to
Right by a microphone.
He's not good. We're trying.
Frank Wolf is going to speak.
No, I know. We're on the phone with Frank Langford's office right now.
Right. No. Okay. We just need to start. Anyway.
No, we're trying. Go ahead.
Give us 1 second.
See if it can work.
Give me 1 second. If this doesn't work.
Speaker.
Okay. Okay, Holly, could you go ahead and try talking?
Hi. This is a test. No, it's not working.
Is this mic?
That's it. So we'll get everybody back.
Thank you, Holly. It's just.
Hello, if I can get everybody to sit back down, please. We're ready to start the next session. If everybody could please take their seats.
I'm questioning. You're asking me a question. Okay, I'll ask. I'll do it. Huh? Judy. You have a question. I do have a question, but like you were questioning, no open statement.
Langford's not making it. He got called for votes. No, if you just let everybody
I'm
know.
on a different issue. I will do that in a minute.
Okay.
He has no open statement. You said you had questions you were going to ask. Okay, let's go. We'll start with them. Let's go. All right. Let's sit near each other. Where are we? Yeah, we're in different ways. Let me just get my notes here. Sure. Good afternoon. My name is John Ruskay. I'm one of the commissioners here at USCIRF. Just a quick apologies for the delay. Let me first say we just learned that a vote was called at the Senate. Senator Langford will not be able to be with us. So good news, we regret that. He's an extraordinary champion on this issue and many others that we care about in the Senate at this time. Can you hear us, by the way? I thought I was quickly elected to the Congress. So we regret that he can't be with us, but we will have more time with Congressman Wolf, who has had such a historic role in the work of this commission and far beyond. Just a word, a day like this, a morning like this, which has been so rich, takes the efforts of many. I want to simply acknowledge the executive director of USCIRF, Erin Sinkenchuk, who's here somewhere, the entire staff, Judy Golub, who really took responsibility to pioneer this. I want to acknowledge that and thank them enormously for their ongoing work day in and day out on this issue. This has been a rich morning. We have noted the accomplishments of 20 years and the challenges. And we're going to get, since this session is titled A Call to Action, in many ways the subject of this session is what is to be done now? How do we build on the accomplishments which are real? If the purpose of this was to elevate the issue of religious freedom and freedom of conscience as a human right, there has been, and one could cite, substantial accomplishment in multiple spheres throughout the government. And yet, I would say in candor, I believe this is a coming attraction. Our 2018 report that will be issued on May 1, the first sentence is a teaser. Religious freedom conditions continue to deteriorate in countries around the globe in 2017. And so while there has been accomplishment, the challenges persist with a few exceptions, where things are getting slightly better, and that represents an extraordinary challenge for all of us. How honored we are to have here today the man who no doubt we wouldn't be here today without the work of Congressman Wolf. It is he who authored the act, as you know. He's considered by many the conscience of the Congress, and the conscience of the Congress challenges. He challenges us to say, this is where we are, and this is where we have to get to, and this is what you did through your tireless work in the 90s, which led to the passage of the Act in 1998, and which you continue to do. We are honored to have you with us, and we look forward. There'll be some opening comments. I think the challenge for us here, and I just want to frame it, and you'll take it as you want, as we all pivot. We've heard about many say, should we work further on CPC and Magnitsky? Can we use sanctions more effectively? The media more effectively? Can prisoners of conscience be a focus? And can we do far more working with many? Mobilizing faith groups, we heard. So the question from my perspective for us today on this 20th, what is to be done? How can we take this to the next level? And do we have the right person here for this last session to help begin this? We'll have some questions, and then the floor will be open. We're honored to have you with us. Congressman Wolf.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this?
This seems hotter.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I want to thank the panelists and all the people that spoke before. I want to thank the commission and all of the members, both present and past. And I particularly want to also thank the staff. The staff over the years has done a great job, so thank you very, very much. There were two questions they wanted me to kind of cover, and I will, but let me just start out by saying my own, I'm speaking for myself and not for any particular group. I think where we are now is a very difficult time. John Quincy Adams, and I'm a great fan of John Quincy Adams, was the last founding father, if you will. He was the last or the last founding father. His father was John Adams at the Declaration of Independence. He knew Franklin, he knew Washington, he knew Jefferson, he knew everyone. At the 50th anniversary of the inauguration of President Washington, George Washington, John Quincy Adams was invited to the New York Historical Society, and he made two comments that kind of stick in my mind. He said that the Declaration of Independence, he said, was a sacred document. You know, all men are created equal. He said it was a sacred document. And then he said, and keep in mind, his dad was there with Franklin and with Jefferson. Then he said, by the ratification of the Constitution, we have legitimized it. We have legitimized the Declaration of Independence. President Reagan, one of my favorite presidents, said that the words in the Constitution and the words in the Declaration of Independence, it was a covenant. You know, a covenant is much stronger than a covenant. It was a covenant not only with the people in Philadelphia, my hometown, 1776 or 1787, when the Constitution was ratified. It was a covenant with the entire world. It was a covenant with Sister Diana, the nun in Iraq, who said to me, Mr. Wolf, does anyone care about us anymore? It's a covenant with a Catholic priest in China. A covenant with Dr. Lee, who when he left the National Prayer Breakfast, went back. And Dr. Lee is dead now, and we think maybe the Chinese government was a covenant. And I personally believe the covenant is being ignored, and in some cases, really shredded up. And this is the opportunity. So two of the questions that were asked, if I could just cover them, because I said, one, they said, what are the challenges today for robust international religious freedom? In what ways do these challenges differ from those that existed in 1998 when IRFA was enacted? I'm going to give you the contrast. There are big differences. The ideas kind of came out of a group of people. They were giants. Chuck Colson could combine a hard-headed reality of faith with a hard-headed reality of having been in the White House and understand. Don Argue with the National Association of Evangelicals, David Saperstein, who was here, Cardinal McCarrick, they were all at that original meeting. It was at the Mayflower where they all came together. They were giants. I remember going home and telling my wife, I was at this meeting today. You know who was there? I didn't know them. And I was there. We don't have that anymore. The swans are silent. We do not have that anymore. So that is one comparison. Secondly, the churches used to be really active. I remember they would have Persecution Sunday, and they would have somebody come in from Sudan, or somebody come in from China, or somebody come in from Vietnam and tell their story. And you can't help but listen to the story to weep and understand. There was even a group, I think they were in Chicago and then maybe Colorado, they used to put these Sundays on all over. They're almost, not totally, they're almost all gone. Very few churches still have services where they bring in dissidents and people who have gone through and suffering and had a very difficult time. Thirdly, and the last one is the fourth one, is what's going to be a little controversial. But thirdly, the groups seem to work better together. On the issue of Sudan, I mean, the Catholic Church would come in, the Protestant Church would come in, the Jewish community would come in, all different groups come in. Everyone was together to focus on Sudan. There was genocide in Sudan. There was no question. They were all focused on it. I find that groups now are sort of fragmented. They're not sort of coming together to say, you know, all for one and one for all. We're going to focus on this particular issue. That is the third difference. The last difference is a little controversial. When the bill was introduced, it was bipartisan. The only really opposition to the bill was really from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. But they didn't really lobby for it. They didn't really pressure people for it. It was not the big issue of the day. Now, what are you up against? In preparation, I got the lobby disclosure report for the largest law firm in the city. The Foreign Agents Registration Act. Squires, Patton, Boggs. They represent Sudan. Ambassador Brownback and I, we went to Darfur. We heard stories of young Muslim girls who had been assaulted what had taken place to them. Much of the activity we see taking place around the world. We know, I was in the Nuba Mountains where a Muslim woman told me, and Christians, that they were bombing them because they were Africans, they were black. They said, what they're doing. How does a major law firm in this city represent Bashir, an indicted war criminal? Not try. He is an indicted war criminal. They get $40,000 a month from Sudan. How do you go home at night? What do? Do you throw up the first time, and after that, just say, I'll take the money. I can have my beach house, or I can take that vacation, or I can own my place in the Cotswolds, or I can do whatever the case may be. Secondly, go look at the report. They made $300,000 and some from China. China, the Catholic Church, is being under great pressure. Bishop Su, who took Holy Communion from Chris Smith, has never been seen again. The Protestant Church is being pummeled. You have Protestant pastors in jail. Dr. Lee met with President Bush, President W. George W. 3 times in the White House. You can see the pictures. He got the Carl Gershon presented the National Endowment for Democracy Award for him. Dr. Lee comes to the National Prayer Breakfast, flies home, dies. The Uyghurs, there are stories, they're true, of Uyghur children being rounded up and taken to detention camps. Does that conjure up something in your mind, detention camps of young children? Falun Gong living a terrible life. Read the Freedom House report last year where they talked to Falun Gong and Uyghurs. They're going through the prisons and taking their blood type. And Tibet. You have cultural genocide in Tibet. I used to say 130 or 140 Tibetan monks, and now today I heard it's up to 150, 52. How does a law firm represent the Chinese government and do that? And then lastly, look at the contributions list that the firm is giving. So I think the difference there is something you have to have the reality of, because during the 80s, no law firm in this city would have ever represented the Soviet Union. I remember there was one group, there was a bus deal that was going to be done, and President Reagan and the White House spoke out against it, and it sort of collapsed. There's also the story that the Russian ambassador says to George Shultz. He says, every time I meet with President Reagan, the first thing he mentions, he says, is human rights and religious freedom. And Shultz says, well, that's amazing. He says, when I meet with the president, that's the first thing he mentions is human rights and religious freedom when he's talking to me. You can see the difference that's taking place then with regard to that. President Reagan gave the speech, the evil empire, and now we see. And there was another, well, I should just, because I don't want to get too more controversial, but you look at the list of registrations. So I think the difference is, one, Colson, Cardinal McCurrick, all the groups, David Saperstein. Look at the groups. I don't know if anybody has a record of who was actually at that meeting compared now. Now, there have been some. Cardinal Dolan's been great. God bless Cardinal Dolan. I think Cardinal Dolan has been great. I think Russell Moore has been great. But overall, we need the faith community to really weigh in. Secondly, we need to come together. If you are being attacked and your group is being attacked, we should defend you so you can then turn around and defend us. And lastly, I think you need a major effort where we wake up the church and wake up the Generation Z and wake up the millennials. I go on college campuses. These are good kids. Sharon mentioned the difference between IJM, and you go onto the college campuses and they're really against, and God bless them, they want to fight sexual trafficking. I think that same effort, if they were given this information, they would be a force for goodness with regard to that. So I think the difference are, one, Colson, not compared now. These groups in town are hiring. I mean, when they were talking about Vietnam, my mind said, who's representing Vietnam? If you're a law firm in town that's now representing Vietnam and you just heard this story, would you go back to and say to your managing partner, we got to cancel them? There was just another member of Congress sign up to represent Turkey. Pastor Brunson, a year and a half, and if the story was true that I read on Religious News Network, and I appreciate the coverage that they give, he was sent back to a jail cell with 22 people in a prison. That's very difficult. Have you ever seen the movie Midnight Express? So I think that's the difference of what it was in 1998 and where we are today. And I think this commission and all of you working together in a bipartisan way, revolutionizing this almost the way that IJM did on sexual trafficking, can really turn this around and really show that the words that Reagan said, that the words in the Declaration of Independence, the words in the Constitution were a covenant, that covenant is reestablished and reinforced in a way that I think will be good for the people of the world.
Don't pack up yet. First of all, word has it that actually Senator Langford did not want to miss, so he is going to come. So we're going to have a few more minutes. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, one could spend the day having a consultation on the question of what it would mean to try to re-engage or engage the faith communities in this work. And that's a subject for a huge day. If you were to say, no one knows this work and the detail of this probably better than you do, there is an ongoing debate in much of this world, where should if one was to heighten this, prisoners of conscience, sanctions, media, women, mobilizing faith groups, if you were to say, because there are always discrete resources, where would you put, say, focus on? Is there one, could you provide some advice at this point in time?
There are, all of the ideas today of all of the panelists and speakers were all good. I agreed with everything that was really said. I think I did something practical and then something really that could have an impact to follow one is the prisoners of conscience. I mean, to be in prison and to be forgotten about. I mean, Nathan Sharansky told me his life got better when people advocated for him. I was in Perm Camp 35 with Chris Smith, and people said that when Reagan gave the evil empire speech, Sharansky said they tapped out on the wall about it. And so I think they're prisoners of conscience to know that people care. I think if you flood, Colonel Osten, the commandant of the camp, they told me, Osten said, why are all these letters coming in about Sharansky? Who do I have? So I think prisoners of conscience is something so important, particularly imagine, there but for the grace of God go on. If you happen to, so I think that's something that's so practical that really can make a difference. Secondly, on the sanctions issue, one or two of the panels in the first panel, I wrote these, the Global Magnitsky Act. I mean, some of the princelings are sending their kids over there, they're buying buildings. We even believe that there may be a couple American companies that are furnishing DNA technology sequencing to the Chinese government to go after Uyghurs and go after Buddhists. That would be something that you could do. Denying visas, if you know somebody has been connected and has done what Judy just said, the person with regard to Tibet has moved to, denying visas. Many of them want to come for education, for a new heart operation, to buy a penthouse somewhere. Thirdly, strengthen CFIUS. They're buying American companies up in such a way that these companies then feel leveraged that they do want to do anything. Let me give you one last thing. You could, next to the last thing, you could name the street in front of the Chinese embassy for Xiaobo, but I'll tell you there's one other thing. CCTV. CCTV is in 30 million households. 30 million households. They are filming show trials. They're filming forced confessions. CCTV should be forced to register as a foreign agent so that everyone understands. You have the Confucius Institutes that are on 100 American college campuses. They would never invite anybody. They would never invite a Catholic bishop from Hong Kong in. They would never invite the Dalai Lama to come in. They would never invite Reba Kadir to come in. They would never invite anybody connected to the Falun Gong to come in. They would never invite Dr. Lee if any of his associates to come in. And they are on 100 American college campuses. Take some sanctions like that. I think that would really make a big difference today.
I'm now experiencing the zigzag life of Congress. Apparently, Senator Langford has now been called by congressional leadership back. So there he is. But we have a couple of minutes for questions from the floor, and then I'm going to ask Chairman Mark to conclude our day. So is there anything that anyone at this moment, it's been a long morning, this has been, yes, I see a hand. Why don't you come on right up and grab a mic and I love your passion.
Thank you so much. My name is Shahzad and I'm from Pakistan and I'm a Christian. My question is for the Honorable Frank. As you mentioned about the need of inviting people from across the globe to share their experiences like in the state. And you also said about the denial of visas. So if, for example, if I talk about myself or the Christian community in Pakistan, we are having Pakistani passport. So traveling with Pakistani passport is a challenge. And how would you see that when we want to come to get education or we want to come here to share our experience of persecution, but our visas are getting denied? So what kind of strategy you think would be better? Because whenever West do something wrong with the Muslim community, so we have to face the consequences. But when we go outside of our country, we are viewed as the same Pakistani Christians. So we lost our identity in our own country, but also in outside of our country.
Well, that's a very difficult issue, and I sympathize with you. Asia Bibi's been in jail for 8 years now, and for blasphemy for a charge. Shahbaz Bhatti, who was a good friend of mine, was gunned down coming out of his mother's house. And I think, I think you should take that case to the American government, but the American government, I think, needs to put pressure on to see some progress from the Pakistanis. We give them tremendous amount of foreign aid. We want them to be our allies. We want them to be our friends. But the Pakistan government has been somewhat sympathetic to the Taliban. Read the new book out by Stephen Call, Directorate S. Has anyone read the book to see what's taking place? And so I think you have to look at the whole picture, but I'm sympathetic and understanding. We want good relations and we want people to come, but we would like to see some. Please tell the Pakistani government, if they want the best PR they can possibly have, release Asia Bibi and let her come to live in the United States with her family. That would make a big difference in what's taking place with regard to Pakistan.
So, as I call on Chairman Mark, I would simply say this remains a powerful, unique place where Republicans and Democrats and people of all religion come together to care deeply about this issue. We should remember it, we can build on it, and take the lessons to mobilize it to take it to the next stage. I thank you, Rabbi. Rabbi? Congratulations.
That's a promotion.
I was just going to say I like the idea of naming the street in front of the Chinese embassy for Jaibo, but he had a much better compliment to pay him, I guess, than I did. We're going to conclude now. I have only very brief remarks to wrap this up. Before we do, I do want to repeat Commissioner Oskay was very right to give thanks to our staff, led by our executive director, who all worked very hard to make this event and everything we do possible. I also do want to add in one additional special word of thanks. Judy Golub, who played the central role in putting together this event, has worked for USCIRF for a very long time. And it's very important to everyone, I think, probably everybody here, certainly everyone who works regularly in the world of international religious freedom, knows Judy already, knows how hard she works and the quality of her work. And so just before I say the very brief concluding remarks, let's all please give a big round of applause to Judy. Thank you, everyone, for attending our summit on international religious freedom. I hope that today's sessions will invigorate our work. Some takeaways, briefly. First, we must use all of the tools at our disposal in support of this precious freedom. This includes the already increasing use of measures that you heard about today, such as visa bans and asset freezes that target individuals, not just countries, who abuse religious freedom. At the same time, there is an urgent need to create new tools to address emerging challenges such as abuses by non-state actors and the need to balance countering extremism with religious freedom. We need to start thinking about IRFA 3.0. Second, this is not and should not be an exclusively American project. We need to reinvigorate our work with our current allies and find new allies to work with. Congress should participate in the International Panel of Parliamentarians, for example, and international religious freedom must remain a truly non-partisan issue in a very partisan time. Third, despite the importance of so many priorities, we must remain vigilant about advocating for international religious freedom in our foreign policy apparatus, setting expectations high, yet strategically. Finally, I note that when I speak on international religious freedom around the country, people always ask me what they can do to help. I always tell them first to pray, but second, I tell them to inform themselves and to educate others. We must bring this issue to the people because constituents must send a clear message to their elected officials that international religious freedom is a priority for them. Current events underscore that we cannot rely on history to produce justice in the long run. It is up to us to bring about justice. Success is not guaranteed, but it is possible. It is in our hands and the hands of our fellow citizens. Thank you very much and have a great day.